The hardest part of locking a husband out in the -10-degree Alaskan winter was not drilling the new steel deadbolts. It was pretending for 14 grueling days that I did not know his pregnant mistress was sleeping down the hall. I spent 2 weeks serving coffee and feigning exhaustion while they shared secret glances over my dining table. They thought they were breaking a fragile postpartum housewife. They forgot they were dealing with a forensic accountant who spent her entire career tracing stolen assets and finding the trapdoors in ironclad contracts. My name is Callista. 3 days after doctors sliced my abdomen open to deliver my son Leo, my mother-in-law moved into my house uninvited. She did not come to help. She came to conquer. If you have ever had your boundaries trampled by the people supposed to protect you, then you know the exact shade of red that colors your vision when they smile to your face. Welcome to Linda Vengeance. Drop a comment below and let me know your age, because I truly believe it takes a certain amount of lived experience to spot a wolf wearing sheep clothing. Now let me take you back to the morning the invasion began. The wind off the Cook Inlet howled against the reinforced glass of my ancestral Anchorage home. I stood in the foyer pressing a thick medical pad against my incision. Every shallow breath sent a hot spike of pain radiating through my lower back. The house was supposed to be a sanctuary of quiet warmth. Instead, the heavy mahogany double doors swung open and a brutal gust of sub-zero air swept across the floorboards. Beatrice Kensington did not bother to ring the bell. A hired driver hauled a pair of vintage steamer trunks over the threshold. The brass corners scraped against the pristine oak with a sound that made my teeth ache. Beatrice followed him inside. She was enveloped in a thick mink coat and an overpowering floral perfume that instantly choked the sterile, clean air of my home. She paused on the antique Persian rug. She looked around with the practiced, assessing eye of a corporate liquidator rather than a new grandmother. She wore tall, leather designer boots caked in dark gray slush. I watched the snow melt from her soles. Dirty water dripped onto the polished wood, forming dark, muddy puddles. She looked down at the mess she was making and then looked back up at me. She made no move to take the boots off. It was a small, silent test of power. She was daring me to correct her in my own home. I took a slow breath, fighting the burning sensation in my stomach. I kept my voice flat and even. I learned long ago in hostile boardrooms that showing emotion only gives your opponent a target. I set up the downstairs guest room for you, Beatrice. The bed is made, and Julian should be home from the shipping port in a few hours. Beatrice unbuttoned her coat, letting it drape over the back of the nearest chair. She waved a leather-gloved hand toward the sweeping staircase. I will take the master suite. Tell the driver to bring my things up there. The words hung in the freezing air. The master suite was my private sanctuary. It held my clothes, my nursing pillows, and the bassinet where Leo slept his first few nights. I gripped the edge of the console table to steady my trembling legs. You cannot take the master suite. Julian and I are sleeping there. My recovery supplies are upstairs. Beatrice offered a smile that contained zero warmth. Her eyes were sharp and unyielding. Julian is at the port dealing with real logistical problems for the family business. He needs his rest when he gets home. My arthritis requires the soaking tub in your attached bathroom. Besides, you will be up all hours of the night with the infant. It makes far more sense for you to take the nursery suite down the hall. Less pacing for you, less disturbance for the rest of us. I stared at her, trying to process the audacity of the demand. I was bleeding. I was surviving on minimal sleep and pain medication. I was standing in a house that my grandfather built and left solely to me in a generation-skipping trust. Yet this woman was assigning me quarters like a warden in a prison. I gave birth 72 hours ago. I am recovering from major surgery. Beatrice sighed the way a teacher sighs at a slow student. She stepped closer. The scent of her heavy rose perfume made my stomach churn. Women have babies every day, Callista. Stop acting fragile. The world does not stop turning just because you did what biology expects of you. You need someone to manage this household while you are incapacitated. I am staying for a month. Be grateful you have family willing to step in. The driver, looking deeply uncomfortable, hoisted the first heavy trunk onto his shoulder and began walking up the curved staircase. The dull thud of his footsteps echoed through the grand foyer. Each step felt like a hammer striking a nail into the coffin of my peace. I could have screamed. I could have threatened to call the police to throw her out into the snow. But I knew Julian would intervene. He would call me hormonal. He would say I was being hysterical and ungrateful to his mother. He would use my anger as proof that I was unstable. I needed time to observe the board before I made my first move. I turned away from her without saying another word. I walked slowly down the long, drafty hallway toward the nursery. My body ached with a heavy structural fatigue. The nursery was tucked away in the northern corner of the estate. It was always the coldest room in the house. I pushed the door open and heard the faint, soft breathing of my son Leo, sleeping in his crib. I sat down in the stiff wooden rocking chair. I pulled a thin fleece blanket over my shoulders and listened. Above me, the floorboards creaked as Beatrice directed the driver on where to place her luggage. The water pipes shuddered as she turned on the hot water in my therapeutic soaking tub. She was taking my space. She was testing my limits. She thought she had established dominance over a weak, isolated woman. She did not realize that by forcing me into the shadows, she had given me the perfect vantage point to watch her every move. The invasion had begun, but I was not a victim waiting to be rescued. I was an auditor, and I was already keeping score. The heavy rumble of a diesel engine cut through the howling Alaskan wind, signaling my husband had returned from the port. I sat in the dim light of the nursery, holding my breath as I listened to the familiar thud of Julian stamping his boots on the porch. A naive part of my chest loosened. I expected Julian to walk into the house, see his mother occupying my private sanctuary, and immediately demand she move to the guest quarters. I expected the man I married to enforce the boundaries we had supposedly built together. I waited for his heavy footsteps to climb the sweeping staircase. The house landline on the small side table suddenly began to ring. The shrill tone startled Leo in his bassinet, causing the baby to whimper. I twisted my torso to reach the receiver before the noise could wake him fully. A sharp, burning sensation tore across my lower abdomen, pulling tight against the surgical tape of my recent incision. I gasped out loud, dropping my arm and clutching my stomach as a hot wave of pain washed over me. Julian stepped into the nursery doorway at that exact moment. He wore his thick wool coat carrying the stark scent of salt air and freezing rain. He looked at my pale face contorted in pain. He looked at the ringing phone. Instead of rushing to my side or handing me the receiver, he merely reached out and pressed the silence button on the base. He did not ask who was calling. He did not ask if I was okay. He turned his back and began unbuttoning his coat, letting it drop carelessly over the back of the nursing chair. The casual dismissal landed harder than a physical blow. I took a slow breath, tasting the metallic tang of fear in the back of my throat. I told him what happened. I explained how Beatrice forced her way into the master's suite, how her steamer trunks were sitting on our rugs, and how she demanded I recover in the drafty northern wing of the house. I waited for the righteous indignation to cross his features. I waited for him to defend his wife. Julian rubbed the bridge of his nose and let out a long, exasperated sigh. He did not march down the hall to confront his mother. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound irritation. He told me I was overreacting to a simple logistical adjustment. He used the phrase hormonal hysteria to describe my distress. He said his mother was offering her valuable time to help us and ordered me to show a little gratitude instead of picking fights over a bathtub. The words hung in the freezing air of the room. Julian was the heir to a prominent maritime dynasty, but the title was a hollow crown. The family shipping routes were hemorrhaging capital, and Beatrice held the ultimate authority over the remaining trust funds. Julian spent his days managing fragile supply chains and his nights desperately seeking his mother's approval. I always believed he married me for my stability. My career as a forensic accountant provided a quiet, steady foundation to his chaotic legacy. Standing there, listening to him dismiss my physical agony to appease his mother, I realized he did not want a partner. He wanted a compliant asset who would balance his ledgers and stay out of the way. He told me to rest and walked out of the room, leaving the door wide open. The emotional neglect settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The pain in my abdomen flared again, reminding me that my body was still healing from major surgery. I needed my prescribed painkillers. The hospital had sent a script to the local pharmacy down the street, and I intended to have it delivered. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the pharmacy number. The pharmacist confirmed the prescription was ready and asked for payment over the phone. I pulled my wallet from my hospital bag and recited the numbers of my primary joint credit card. I listened to the steady tapping of her keyboard, followed by a long, uncomfortable pause. She returned to the line and informed me the card had declined. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I assumed it was a simple fraud alert triggered by the hospital bills. I read the numbers for our secondary discretionary account. The keyboard tapped again. Another pause. The pharmacist sounded apologetic when she told me the second card also declined. She asked if I had a third option. I politely canceled the delivery and ended the call. My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened my banking application on my phone. The screen loaded, revealing a stark, undeniable truth. My login credentials had been revoked. I tried my desktop browser, yielding the same result. The accounts were not empty. My access had simply been severed. I wrapped a thick fleece robe around my shivering shoulders and forced myself to stand. Every step down the grand staircase was a battle against my own failing body. I navigated the long hallway toward the study, where a warm fire crackled in the hearth. The heavy oak door was ajar. Julian stood by the mahogany bar cart. Beatrice sat in the leather wingback chair, her feet propped near the fire. Julian was pouring amber scotch into 2 heavy crystal tumblers. The scene was picturesque and entirely exclusionary. I stepped into the room, clutching the lapels of my robe. I did not yell. I asked Julian a direct, clinical question about why my cards were rejecting charges at the pharmacy. Julian handed a glass to his mother before turning to face me. He did not look guilty. He did not look surprised. He took a slow sip of his drink and offered a thin, patronizing smile. He casually admitted to contacting the bank that morning. He explained that he froze my access to our joint discretionary accounts to manage my stress spending during my maternity leave. He claimed that women in a postpartum state often make erratic financial decisions, and he was simply protecting our assets until my mind was clear. Beatrice took a sip of her scotch and stared into the fire, a silent, smug witness to my financial execution. The air left my lungs. He was not protecting our finances. He was actively partnering with his mother to strip me of my agency. They knew I could not drive to the bank. They knew I was physically isolated in the house. By cutting off my access to our capital, they ensured I could not hire outside help, book a hotel room, or even purchase basic medical supplies without begging for their permission. The emotional neglect had rapidly mutated into a calculated financial hostage situation. I did not argue. Arguing with a man who steals your resources while smiling at you is a waste of breath. I turned around and walked back into the freezing hallway. The physical pain of my incision was a dull throb compared to the sharp, glacial clarity taking shape in my mind. I climbed the stairs one agonizing step at a time and returned to the cramped nursery. The wind battered the frosted window panes, making the room feel like an icebox. I sat in the rocking chair and pulled Leo against my chest, burying my face in the soft fabric of his swaddle. Downstairs, the faint sound of clinking crystal echoed up the ventilation shaft. Mother and son were toasting to their successful usurpation of the household dynamics. They thought they had secured a total victory. They thought they had rendered me helpless. The betrayal severed the final tether of trust I held for the man I married. The warm, forgiving wife who wanted to build a family died in that cold room. In her place, a senior forensic accountant woke up. I spent 10 years dismantling corporate embezzlement schemes, tracing hidden offshore accounts, and destroying arrogant men who thought they were smarter than the paper trail. Julianne and Beatrice believed they had trapped me in a cage. They failed to realize they had locked themselves inside with a predator. I stopped crying. I began to calculate. And just as I mapped out my first silent countermeasure, the doorbell rang, echoing through the estate and introducing a new, unforeseen threat to my doorstep. The chime of the doorbell echoed up the grand staircase, cutting through the low hum of the wind. I froze in the rocking chair. Nobody visits an isolated estate in the middle of a blizzard unless it is an emergency. My first thought was a medical crisis at the port. My second thought, driven by the new cynical lens I viewed my marriage through, was much darker. I placed Leo gently back into his crib, pulling the thick cotton swaddle tight around his small shoulders. I wrapped my fleece robe tighter around my waist and shuffled toward the bedroom door. The surgical tape across my abdomen pulled with every step, acting as a stark physical reminder of my limitations. I stepped out onto the second-floor landing and peered over the carved mahogany railing. The heavy front doors were open again, letting in a swirling vortex of white snow. Julianne stood in the entryway, holding the door against the gale. A woman stepped inside, stomping her sleek leather boots on the rug. She was not a stranded motorist. She was not a dock worker bringing news of a shipping delay. It was Maya. Maya served as Julian's executive assistant at Kensington Maritime. He hired her 8 months ago, claiming her background in modern logistics would help drag the archaic shipping firm into the 21st century. She was 26 years old, with sharp features and a wardrobe that always seemed just a fraction too expensive for her salary. I had met her twice at company dinners. Both times she smiled at me with a polite, shallow warmth that never quite reached her eyes. Now she stood in my foyer, shivering in a tailored wool coat. Beatrice materialized from the study, holding a warm cashmere throw blanket. My mother-in-law wrapped the blanket around the young woman with a level of maternal tenderness she had never once directed toward me. The boiler in her downtown apartment building ruptured, Beatrice announced. She projected her voice, carrying the words up the stairs, ensuring I would hear every syllable. The city shut off the power to the entire block. It is a death trap in this weather. We must show some Christian charity, Julian. Maya can stay in the downstairs guest suite until the management company fixes the heating grid. Julian nodded, his face arranged into a mask of solemn concern. He took Maya's snow-covered coat and hung it on the brass rack. He did not ask my permission. He did not even look up at the landing to see if I was watching. He simply picked up her sleek overnight bag and guided her toward the southern wing of the house. He led her to the exact suite I had prepared for Beatrice hours earlier. The social dynamic of my home fractured and reorganized itself in the span of 3 minutes. Maya did not behave like a displaced refugee seeking shelter from a winter storm. She carried herself with the relaxed posture of an invited guest. I watched them disappear down the corridor. My chest felt hollow. The estate was no longer just occupied by a hostile mother-in-law. A new invader had breached the walls. I waited 2 hours before going downstairs. The baby needed a fresh bottle, and I needed a glass of ice water to soothe the dry ache in my throat. The house was quiet. The wind outside had settled into a steady, low moan. I navigated the stairs carefully, clutching the wooden banister for support. The kitchen was a sprawling, chef-caliber space outfitted in white marble and stainless steel. It usually carried a very specific scent. It normally smelled of boiled plastic bottle nipples and the faint, chalky aroma of baby formula. It was a sterile, innocent smell that grounded me in the reality of motherhood. As I pushed open the swinging door, that familiar scent was gone. It was replaced by a cloying, expensive perfume. Heavy notes of dark amber and vanilla hung in the warm air, masking the innocent scent of my newborn son. Maya stood by the central island. She wore a silk camisole and matching lounge pants that looked entirely out of place in the freezing Alaskan climate. She did not jump when I entered. She turned slowly, holding a steaming mug in her hands. "I hope you do not mind, Callista," she said, her voice smooth and unbothered. The chill in my bones just would not fade, so I came in here to make a hot drink. Julian mentioned you keep the good espresso around here somewhere. I stopped near the doorway. I watched her glide across the kitchen. She did not ask me where the espresso was located. She did not open random cupboards searching for the coffee pods. She walked directly to the unmarked pantry door on the far left. She opened it, reached onto the second shelf, and pulled out the imported dark roast pods Julian ordered exclusively from a broker in Seattle. Then she turned to the glassware cabinet. Out of 6 identical opaque drawers, she pulled open the exact one containing the Baccarat crystal mugs. She moved with an alarming familiarity. A person only knows a kitchen that intimately if they have spent significant time inside it. Time when the wife is not home. Time when the wife is busy working late at her accounting firm or confined to a hospital bed recovering from a cesarean section. I walked to the sink and turned on the cold tap. I filled the glass, focusing on the steady stream of water rather than the pounding rhythm of my own heart. I did not want to look at her, but my forensic instincts demanded I gather data. I took a sip of the water and let my eyes travel over her reflection in the dark window pane above the sink. The ambient lighting under the cabinets caught a flash of metal resting against her collarbone. I turned my head slightly to get a better look. She wore a heavy, custom gold pendant. The metal was hammered into a distinct teardrop shape, suspended on a thick, braided chain. The air in my lungs turned to ice. 2 months ago, Julian and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary. We attended a silent auction at the Anchorage Museum. A local jeweler debuted a collection of bespoke pieces, and that exact hammered gold pendant was the centerpiece. I stood in front of the glass display case for 20 minutes, admiring the craftsmanship. Julian put his arm around my waist and kissed my temple. He told me it was beautiful, but the shipping route losses had been severe that quarter. He claimed the piece was far too expensive for our budget. He promised he would buy it for me next year when the company profits stabilized. Yet here it was. The bespoke necklace hung proudly around the neck of his 26-year-old executive assistant. She caught me staring at it. She did not blush or try to tuck the jewelry beneath the silk fabric of her camisole. She lifted her free hand and traced the edge of the hammered gold with a manicured fingernail. "Julian has such wonderful taste," Maya murmured, taking a slow sip from the crystal mug. "He gave this to me as a bonus for restructuring the filing system, a token of appreciation for my hard work." The subtext of her words crashed into me with the force of a freight train. She was not hiding the affair. She was flaunting it. The boiler failure was a fabricated excuse to bring his mistress into the house under my nose. Beatrice played the enabler, using the guise of charity to justify the invasion. My husband used the money he claimed we did not have to adorn the woman sleeping in my guest bed. They formed a unified exclusionary family unit, and they were forcing me to serve as a captive audience. The disrespect was profound, deliberate, and happening right in front of my face. They believed they could parade their betrayal through my kitchen because I was too weak and financially paralyzed to fight back. My mind began to race, tracing the financial implications. If Julian had the discretionary funds to purchase a custom gold pendant, it meant he was hiding capital. As an accountant, I knew that money always leaves a trail. The frozen credit cards, the sudden presence of his mistress, and the mother-in-law running interference were all pieces of a larger puzzle. I looked at the young woman standing in my home, wearing jewelry bought with my marital assets. I did not throw the glass of water. I did not scream or demand she leave. If I reacted with anger, they would use it to label me unhinged. If I demanded a divorce, Julian would deploy his expensive lawyers to drag out the proceedings while I had no access to my own funds. I needed a different strategy. I needed to become invisible. I realized the only way to survive the siege and prepare my counteroffensive was to give them exactly what they wanted. I had to convince them that their psychological warfare was working. I had to make them believe the strong, capable forensic accountant they feared was gone, replaced by a broken, subservient housewife who lacked the spine to defend her own territory. It was time to construct an illusion so convincing they would never see the blade coming until it was already drawn. Surviving a hostile corporate takeover requires a deep understanding of the enemy ego. Arrogant people thrive on the feeling of superiority. If I fought Julian and Beatrice in the open, they would unite their resources against a common threat. They would use my resistance to label me unhinged and unstable. If I collapsed, however, they would lower their defensive shields and bask in the warm glow of their triumph. I decided to give them a spectacular collapse. I needed to become a ghost in my own home. The following morning, I dragged my aching body out of the nursery long before the sun rose over the Chugach Mountains. I navigated the drafty hallway toward the kitchen to begin my performance. The marble floor sent a sharp chill up my bare feet. I tied an old faded apron over my fleece robe. I pulled a heavy cast-iron skillet from the bottom cabinet, biting the inside of my cheek to endure the burning pull of my surgical stitches. I stood at the stove frying bacon and scrambling eggs. I arranged the food onto the expensive porcelain plates Julian preferred. Maya glided into the kitchen a short time later. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. She looked rested and radiant. She paused when she saw me standing by the stove holding a serving spatula. She expected me to glare at her. She expected another tense, silent standoff. Instead, I lowered my eyes and practiced a perfectly defeated posture. I let my shoulders sag. I took a slow breath and offered a hollow apology. I told Maya I had been a terrible host regarding her sudden arrival. I blamed my erratic behavior on postpartum hormones and the stress of a newborn. I kept my voice soft and wavering. Maya accepted the apology with a sweet, condescending smile. She stepped closer and placed a manicured hand on my shoulder. She told me she understood how difficult the transition to motherhood could be for older women. The patronizing insult landed exactly as she intended. I forced myself to nod submissively, swallowing the bitter taste of bile in my throat. The true test of my restraint arrived that evening. The winter storm outside had intensified, burying the estate under 2 feet of fresh snow. A warm fire crackled in the study hearth. Beatrice sat in the leather wingback chair, demanding her evening drink. At exactly 6 o'clock every night, my mother-in-law required a glass of imported sherry. I walked to the mahogany bar cart. The lead crystal decanter felt impossibly heavy in my weakened hands. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the stopper. I poured the amber liquid, watching it splash against the sides of the delicate tulip glass. It took every ounce of mental discipline I possessed not to hurl the crystal decanter directly into the roaring fireplace. I wanted to watch it shatter. I wanted to scream. Instead, I picked up the small glass and carried it across the room. I plastered a stiff, hollow smile onto my face. I handed the drink to Beatrice and thanked her for offering her valuable time to help us manage the estate during my recovery. Beatrice took the glass without a word of gratitude. She took a slow sip and praised me for finally understanding my proper place in the family hierarchy. She looked at me with the supreme satisfaction of a monarch who had just crushed a peasant rebellion. I returned to the nursery and initiated the next phase of my strategy. In the world of forensic auditing, we often use a tactic called the honeypot. When you investigate corrupt executives, you present them with a minor, obvious flaw to hold their attention. They focus so intently on the fake vulnerability that they leave their real crimes exposed. I needed to create a honeypot. I needed a red herring to convince them my mind was truly unraveling. I waited until the house went quiet. I slipped out of the nursery and crept down into the climate-controlled wine cellar in the basement. I scanned the wooden racks and selected a vintage bottle of Merlot Julian purchased during a trip to Napa Valley. I carried the dark glass bottle back upstairs to the small bathroom attached to the nursery. I pulled the cork and tipped the bottle over the porcelain sink. The rich, red wine cascaded down the drain, looking eerily similar to fresh blood against the white ceramic. I poured exactly half the contents away. I dabbed a few drops of the Merlot onto my fingertips and rubbed the liquid onto my neck and collarbone. The sweet, fermented scent of alcohol clung to my skin. I carried the half-empty bottle and a single wine glass into the nursery. I poured a small amount into the glass, intentionally letting a few drops spill onto the wooden nightstand to create a sloppy red ring. I left the uncorked bottle in plain sight right next to my nursing chair. I climbed into the narrow bed and pulled the blankets up to my chin. I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing. Less than an hour later, the nursery door creaked open. Beatrice never bothered to knock. I heard her soft leather slippers shuffling across the floorboards. She paused near the bassinet to check on Leo, and then her footsteps moved toward the nightstand. I heard a sharp intake of breath. The rustle of fabric followed as she snatched the wine bottle from the table. She scurried out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. 10 minutes later, heavy footsteps marched down the hallway. Julian and Beatrice stood just outside the nursery, whispering in harsh, urgent tones. Beatrice sounded triumphant. She presented the bottle as irrefutable evidence of my collapse. She told Julian I was spiraling. She claimed I was suffering from a severe postpartum relapse and drinking heavily around the infant. Julian responded with a sound of utter disgust. He muttered that I was becoming a liability. He thanked his mother for keeping a watchful eye on his fragile, unstable wife. They walked away together, their voices fading down the corridor. The trap had snapped shut perfectly. They swallowed the bait without a single second of hesitation. The following morning, the atmosphere in the dining room was remarkably relaxed. Julian and Maya sat at the long table eating fresh grapefruit and reading the morning financial papers. Because they believed I was a broken, depressed shell of a woman, they no longer felt the need to hide their affection. I stood by the sideboard, pouring dark roast coffee from a silver carafe. I watched their reflection in the ornate mirror hanging above the mantel. Underneath the mahogany table, Julian shifted his leg until his knee pressed firmly against Maya's thigh. She did not pull away. She smiled down at her plate and let her hand drop below the table to trace the fabric of his trousers. They shared lingering romantic glances over the rim of their coffee cups. They thought the exhausted woman serving their breakfast was oblivious to their affair. They were completely unaware that the tired housewife was a senior forensic accountant meticulously documenting their every move. I noted the exact time Julian left for the shipping port. I memorized the label on the blue folder Maya carried into the study. I cataloged the new designer shoes Maya wore, calculating the retail cost and cross-referencing it against the missing funds from my joint accounts. My silence was not surrender. It was the quiet calm before a devastating, mathematically precise storm. I cleared their empty plates and washed the dishes with steady, rhythmic motions. The physical pain in my abdomen remained, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. As I dried the crystal glasses, I noticed Beatrice standing near the living room window, holding her cell phone close to her ear, her voice with a low, hushed murmur. I stopped moving and strained to listen over the sound of the running faucet. She was not talking to a friend. She was using clinical terminology. She mentioned behavioral instability and the urgent need to protect the child. She looked over her shoulder, locking eyes with me through the kitchen doorway. Her gaze was cold and predatory. She ended the call quickly and slid the phone into her pocket. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The red herring had worked too well. My fabricated breakdown convinced them I was weak, but it also gave them the exact ammunition they needed to launch a much darker, far more dangerous offensive. I woke up in the dark, shivering under a thin fleece blanket. The pain in my abdomen pulsed with a hot, rhythmic ache demanding attention. I reached across the wooden nightstand, searching for the familiar amber plastic bottle. My fingers brushed against the smooth cylinder. I lifted it and gave a gentle shake. The expected rattle of medication did not happen. The bottle felt entirely hollow. I stared at the orange plastic in the dim moonlight. I had carefully counted the remaining pills just yesterday morning, ensuring I had enough to last the week. There were exactly 14 small white tablets left. Now, there were 0. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I unscrewed the childproof cap and ran my finger along the inside of the empty rim. They were gone. The realization sent a sharp spike of genuine fear through my chest. The psychological campaign had shifted. Beatrice was no longer satisfied with domestic humiliation or simple financial isolation. She was actively tampering with my medical recovery. 2 days later, the campaign escalated into physical danger. I walked down the hall toward the kitchen to fetch a glass of water and hit a wall of noxious fumes. The raw, dizzying smell of natural gas filled the air. I heard a faint hissing sound. One of the front stove burners was turned on high without a flame to ignite it. I rushed forward, twisting the metal dial off and coughing as the toxic air burned the back of my throat. I threw open the window above the sink, letting the freezing winter wind sweep the poison out of the room. Beatrice stood in the adjoining dining room doorway, sipping her morning tea. She watched me gasp for fresh air with a look of practiced pity. She slowly shook her head and muttered a comment about my declining cognitive state. She claimed I came downstairs an hour ago, tried to boil water, and forgot to ignite the burner. I had not left the nursery all morning. I stared at her serene face, realizing the depth of her cruelty. She was willing to risk blowing up the estate just to build a narrative of my incompetence. That same afternoon, the receiver for the baby monitor went silent. I sat in the rocking chair reading a book while Leo slept in his crib across the room. The usual low hum of white noise emitted by the speaker suddenly vanished. I stood up, ignoring the sharp pull of my surgical stitches, and walked to the dresser. The monitor screen was black. I traced the power cord down to the baseboard. The plug lay on the carpet, neatly disconnected from the wall socket. A heavy pronged cord does not simply fall out of a grounded outlet. Someone had to pinch the plastic and pull with intent. They were orchestrating a series of calculated incidents. They were painting me as a negligent mother who could not keep track of her medication, who left explosive gas running in a wooden house, and who failed to monitor her newborn infant. They were building a case, and I needed to know the end goal. The true scope of their plot revealed itself on a quiet Tuesday. Leo was crying in his crib, his tiny face red with frustration. He dropped his favorite silicone pacifier earlier that morning. I searched the nursery floor and the hallway, but found nothing. I remembered Beatrice holding him near the foyer before Julian left for the shipping port. I walked downstairs. The house was dead silent. Maya was out running errands for Julian, and Beatrice was taking a long soak in my therapeutic tub. Beatrice left her oversized leather tote bag slouched against the entryway console table. I crouched down and unzipped the main compartment, hoping to find the missing pacifier nestled among her belongings. I pushed aside a silk scarf, a leather wallet, and a pair of reading glasses. My fingers brushed against a thick manila folder. The stiff paper felt dense and heavy. My forensic instincts flared. I pulled the folder out and opened the cover. Inside sat a stack of crisp, white paper. The header bore the embossed logo of a private psychiatric clinic located in downtown Anchorage. I scanned the first page. It was a drafted medical affidavit. The signature line at the bottom belonged to a Dr. Elias Thorne. I read the paragraphs with growing horror. The doctor described a patient exhibiting extreme postpartum psychosis. He cited erratic behavior, auditory hallucinations, and a disturbing detachment from reality. He specifically noted that the patient harbored paranoid delusions regarding her husband's fidelity, a neat legal trick to discredit any future claims I might make about Maya. The affidavit listed the empty pill bottle, the unlit gas burner, and the unplugged baby monitor as documented clinical evidence of my decline. The doctor concluded that I posed an imminent threat to myself and my infant son. He recommended an immediate involuntary psychiatric hold. I stared at the black ink tracing the letters until my vision blurred. I had never met Dr. Elias Thorne. I had never set foot inside his private clinic. He was a hired gun, a physician kept on the Kensington Maritime payroll to handle corporate medical clearances and workers' compensation denials. Julian and Beatrice colluded with him to fabricate a severe mental health diagnosis without ever conducting a physical evaluation. The strategy was horrifyingly logical. Julian knew he could not simply file for divorce and take the Anchorage estate. The property was shielded by an ironclad generation-skipping trust established by my late grandfather. The legal parameters of the trust explicitly protected the asset from marital division. A standard divorce would leave Julian with nothing but his failing shipping routes and a hefty child support obligation. But a medical conservatorship changed the rules of the board. If a licensed psychiatrist declared me legally incompetent, Julian would immediately file for an emergency medical proxy. The state would grant him total control over my physical autonomy, my financial portfolio, and my child. I would be locked inside a psychiatric ward, unable to contact a lawyer, while Julian assumed conservatorship over the trust. He could then leverage the equity of the estate to save his sinking company and move his pregnant mistress into the master suite permanently. The stakes skyrocketed in the span of 3 printed pages. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a failed marriage or a spat about an unwanted house guest. This was a fight for my fundamental freedom. If I failed to outmaneuver them, I would lose my son, my home, and my sanity. My hands shook as I pulled my cell phone from my robe pocket. I opened the camera application and photographed every single page of the fraudulent affidavit. I captured the letterhead, the forged symptom list, and the signature line. I needed an undeniable paper trail to prove premeditated extortion. I carefully aligned the papers, placed them back into the manila folder, and tucked the folder beneath the silk scarf inside the leather tote bag. I zipped the bag closed, leaving the metal clasps at the exact angle I found them. I stood up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed legal counsel. I needed to move my remaining liquid wealth before Julian filed the proxy paperwork with the judge. I needed a fortress. But before I could formulate the next step of my counteroffensive, a heavy luxury vehicle turned into the snowy driveway. The headlights cut through the fading afternoon gloom, reflecting off the high snowbanks. I walked to the frosted window and peered outside. The vehicle parked next to the truck Julian drove. The engine cut off, and the driver's side door swung open. A tall woman stepped out onto the packed snow. She wore a tailored wool trench coat and carried herself with the same arrogant posture as my husband. It was Julian's older sister, Victoria. Victoria managed the logistical operations for the family shipping empire from a high-rise office in Seattle. She possessed a sharp, ruthless intellect and harbored a deep disdain for my middle-class background. She viewed my marriage to Julian as a stain on the Kensington pedigree. If Beatrice was the architect of the psychological siege, Victoria was the enforcer. She did not visit Anchorage unless there was a lucrative contract to sign or a rival company to liquidate. Her sudden arrival meant they were preparing to execute the final phase of their hostile takeover. The trap was closing, and the house was about to become far more crowded. I turned away from the frosted glass, bracing myself for the storm, walking up my front steps. The pieces were all in play, and the true war for my survival had just begun. The heavy oak front doors swung inward, bringing a fresh wave of sub-zero wind into the foyer. Victoria Kensington stepped over the threshold, carrying an air of absolute authority. She did not wait for a greeting. She handed her leather gloves to the hired driver and shook the snow from her tailored wool trench coat. Her sharp dark eyes immediately scanned the architecture of my ancestral home before settling on me. I stood near the base of the staircase, holding a burp cloth tight against my chest. Julian possessed the charming facade of the Kensington dynasty, but Victoria operated as the ruthless logistical engine. She managed the global routing schedules from a high-rise office overlooking the Seattle harbor. She grew up attending elite boarding schools and regarded anyone outside her tax bracket as a different species. My upbringing in a standard suburban neighborhood and my degree from a state university offended her sensibilities. She viewed my marriage to her younger brother as a severe miscalculation. Now, she was here to ensure that mathematical error was permanently erased. I forced my shoulders to slump, maintaining the illusion of a defeated woman. I greeted her with a quiet, monotone voice. She ignored my words entirely. She walked past me, leaving a trail of freezing moisture on the hardwood floor, and headed straight for the study, where her mother and brother waited. The air in the house grew instantly thicker. The claustrophobia pressed against my ribcage. 4 adults now occupied my property, treating the estate like a luxury resort where I functioned as the unpaid custodial staff. Their combined presence was designed to be the final nail in my coffin. They wanted to exert enough pressure to guarantee my institutionalization went smoothly. The true depth of their coordinated disrespect crystallized the following morning. I stood in the kitchen near the stainless steel sink. I had spent 20 minutes carefully sanitizing the plastic flanges and valves of my breast pump. They rested on a clean microfiber drying mat, ready for the next feeding. The sterile environment was the one small victory I could control. Victoria strode into the kitchen, returning from a brief walk around the snowy perimeter of the property. Her cheeks were flushed from the freezing wind. She unwound a heavy silk scarf from her neck. The fabric was damp with melted snow and carried the distinct odor of exhaust from the idling luxury vehicles outside. She walked directly toward the sink. Instead of hanging the garment on the brass hooks provided near the mudroom, she dropped the wet silk directly onto my sterile pump equipment. Dirty gray water immediately seeped into the clean plastic tubing. I froze. My hands gripped the edge of the granite countertop. The stone felt like ice against my palms. I looked at the ruined supplies and then up at my sister-in-law. Victoria offered a thin, tight smile. It was a silent, calculated challenge. She wanted me to snap. She wanted me to raise my voice and scream about contamination so she could document another instance of my supposed postpartum hysteria. I tasted copper in the back of my throat. I did not yell. I did not throw the wet scarf back at her. I lowered my chin, letting my eyes drop to the floor. I picked up the ruined plastic parts and quietly dropped them back into the basin of soapy hot water. I scrubbed them again in total silence. Victoria let out a short, dismissive scoff and turned her back to me, pouring herself a cup of imported espresso. She walked away, convinced she had conquered my spirit. That evening, the dynamic among the four invaders shifted into a celebratory gear. Julian, Maya, Beatrice, and Victoria gathered in the expansive, formal living room. A large fire roared in the stone hearth. I remained banished to the drafty northern wing, tasked with keeping the infant quiet while they conducted their family business. Sitting in the dim nursery, I listened to the sounds drifting up the central heating vents, the clinking of crystal tumblers against glass tables, the rhythmic sloshing of expensive bourbon being poured over heavy ice spheres. Their voices grew louder as the alcohol flowed freely. They were celebrating their impending victory. They believed the medical proxy was a guaranteed success. They thought they had secured control over my generational wealth and eliminated the annoying forensic accountant standing in their way. But their arrogance created a fatal vulnerability. Victoria was the true mastermind behind the shipping ledgers. She held the keys to the financial kingdom they were trying to protect. By traveling to Anchorage to oversee my demise, she brought her laptops, her secure encrypted phones, and her unfiltered knowledge directly into my territory. They thought they were crowding me out of my own home. In reality, they were crowding themselves onto a sinking ship. An investigator usually spends months fighting through corporate lawyers and jurisdictional red tape to gather the key players of a fraud ring into one room. Julian and Beatrice had done the hardest part of my job for me. They delivered the entire hostile board of directors straight to my doorstep. The alcohol continued to fuel their overconfidence. Intoxicated people lose their discipline. They forget who is listening in the shadows. I rocked Leo until his breathing slowed into a deep, rhythmic slumber. I laid him gently into the bassinet and pulled the nursery door open without making a sound. The hallway was cloaked in darkness. I moved silently across the thick carpet, patting my steps the way a predator stalks through tall grass. I reached the top of the grand staircase and crouched near the ornate wooden banister. Below me, the warm light from the living room spilled across the foyer tiles. Their conversation morphed from hushed planning into loud, boastful declarations. Victoria was holding court, analyzing the future of the shipping firm, while Julian nodded eagerly. Maya sat close to my husband, her hand resting casually on his knee. Beatrice monitored the fire, adding fresh birch logs to keep the room blazing. I sat perfectly still on the landing, waiting. I knew that when greedy people gather to divide stolen spoils, they inevitably fight over the math. I just needed one of them to speak the wrong number out loud. I needed a single thread to pull. The clinking of ice against crystal echoed again, signaling another round of drinks. As the hour grew late, the filter on their conversation began to dissolve, setting the stage for a revelation that would alter the trajectory of my entire existence. The hardwood floor of the upper landing pressed a cold, rigid ache into my bare knees. I crouched in the suffocating darkness, gripping the carved oak balustrade. The house was quiet, except for the steady crackle of burning birchwood and the low murmur of voices drifting up from the formal living room. I steadied my breathing. The surgical tape across my abdomen pulled tight, a sharp reminder of the physical boundaries tying me to this freezing house. Downstairs, the celebration continued. The clinking of ice against crystal echoed through the foyer as someone poured another round of drinks. It was Victoria. Her distinct, commanding tone cut through the ambient noise of the fire. She spoke with the relaxed cadence of a woman who believed her enemies were thoroughly defeated. I peered between the wooden spindles. The warm amber light cast long shadows across the Persian rug. Maya sat curled on the plush velvet sofa, holding a delicate snifter. Julian leaned against the stone mantel, looking remarkably proud. Beatrice occupied her usual wingback chair, swirling a dark liquid in her glass. They presented a perfect portrait of a wealthy, untouchable dynasty. Victoria paced slowly in front of the hearth. She took a sip of her bourbon and let out a soft, congratulatory sigh. She turned her attention directly to the young executive assistant. "I still cannot believe you managed to travel in this terrible weather, Maya," Victoria said, her voice dripping with an uncharacteristic warmth. "You need to be far more careful now. We cannot risk any unnecessary stress. 6 weeks along is a delicate stage. You must prioritize your health." The words hung in the air, suspended in the smoke and the shadows. 6 weeks along. My fingers tightened around the oak spindle until my knuckles turned stark white. A phantom cold washed over my skin, sinking deep into my bones. The fabricated boiler failure, the sudden arrival in a blizzard, the heavy gold pendant, it all snapped into a sickeningly clear picture. Julian was not just indulging in a shallow workplace romance. He was funding a second family. While I endured the final grueling months of my pregnancy, carrying his legitimate heir, he was actively cultivating a replacement with his 26-year-old assistant. Maya offered a demure musical laugh. She placed a manicured hand over her flat stomach. She thanked Victoria for the concern and praised Julian for being so incredibly supportive during her first trimester. Beatrice chimed in, agreeing that the Kensington bloodline required strong, capable mothers to carry it forward. The matriarch practically purred with satisfaction. They all knew. My husband, my mother-in-law, and my sister-in-law were entirely complicit. They orchestrated the psychological siege to break me so they could seamlessly transition Maya into my place. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the wooden banister. I did not shed a tear. The time for weeping had expired the moment my credit cards declined at the pharmacy. My grief calcified, transforming into a cold, forensic detachment. Then the conversation shifted, and the true nature of their vulnerability revealed itself. Victoria stopped pacing. She set her crystal glass on the mahogany coffee table with a sharp, definitive click. The maternal warmth vanished from her tone, replaced by the icy precision of a corporate executive. She directed her gaze toward Julian. "We need to discuss the Seattle property," Victoria stated, crossing her arms. "The escrow closes next Friday. It is a beautiful estate, Maya, and the extra bedrooms will make a perfect new nursery." "But the financing is a mess, Julian. I spent 3 hours reviewing the quarterly ledgers on my flight to Anchorage." Julian shifted uncomfortably against the mantel. He shoved his hands into his trouser pockets, avoiding his sister's sharp stare. He muttered a vague reassurance, claiming the capital was secure and the wire transfers were already scheduled. Victoria let out a short, bitter laugh. "Do not insult my intelligence, Julian. I see the logistical gaps you are creating in the shipping manifests. You are diverting operational funds to cover the down payment on the Seattle house. You disguise the withdrawal as a maritime insurance premium. It is sloppy." The air in my lungs turned to ice. My analytical mind began processing the variables at lightning speed. Victoria assumed Julian was merely shifting funds from their shared operational budget. She thought her younger brother was committing a minor internal infraction, borrowing company money to hide his mistress and fund a secret real estate transaction. She scolded him for being careless, warning him that the board of directors might notice the missing capital during the annual review. Julian offered a defensive stammer. He promised to replenish the account before the end of the fiscal quarter. He begged his sister to overlook the discrepancy, claiming he needed the Seattle property secured before my medical proxy was finalized. He promised the Anchorage estate would serve as collateral once I was locked inside a psychiatric ward. Victoria sighed, rubbing her temples. She agreed to cover for him temporarily, but demanded he clean up the ledgers by Monday. She picked up her bourbon and returned to her seat, ignorant of the catastrophic truth she just exposed. I sat in the dark hallway, my mind racing. Victoria possessed a brilliant logistical mind, but she lacked the specialized training of a forensic auditor. She saw a gap in the ledger and assumed it was a temporary loan. I knew the shipping industry. I knew the profit margins Julian managed. A maritime insurance premium for their fleet would cost millions of dollars. The Seattle real estate market was expensive, but a down payment on a luxury home did not require that level of capital. Julian was not just borrowing money to buy a house for Maya. The missing funds were vastly disproportionate to the cost of a single estate. He was embezzling on a sweeping, catastrophic scale. He was siphoning wealth directly from the company investors and using the Seattle property purchase to launder a fraction of the stolen cash. The rest of the money was vanishing into a black hole. The twist was breathtaking in its audacity. Julian was committing federal corporate fraud. He was stealing from his own sister. Victoria came to Anchorage to help him destroy my life, unaware that her beloved brother was simultaneously draining her operational budget to line his own pockets. The Kensington family presented a united front of aristocratic superiority, but the foundation was rotting from the inside out. I pressed my hand against my mouth to silence the harsh breath escaping my lips. Julian handed me the exact weapon I needed. A domestic dispute over infidelity or a coerced psychiatric hold would require a long, grueling legal battle in family court. A judge might pity a postpartum mother, but they would respect the deep pockets of the Kensington dynasty. Federal fraud, however, was a different arena entirely. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not care about aristocratic pedigrees. The Internal Revenue Service did not care about Beatrice and her cruel psychological games. If I could prove Julian was falsifying cargo manifests and embezzling investor capital, the federal government would dismantle his life with a ruthless mathematical efficiency I could only dream of. To secure my freedom, I did not need to fight my mother-in-law or confront the pregnant mistress sleeping in my guest room. I needed to destroy the shipping firm. I rose slowly from the floorboards, ignoring the searing pain radiating from my surgical wound. I retreated down the corridor, moving like a shadow, returning to the cold, quiet sanctuary of the nursery. Leo remained fast asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. I locked the door behind me. I walked to the small closet and pulled my encrypted work laptop from its hidden compartment beneath a stack of baby blankets. The battery was fully charged. The estate internet router was located in the study downstairs, but I possessed a secure mobile hotspot for my forensic investigations. I sat in the rocking chair and opened the sleek silver device. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue glow across the dark room. Julian believed he froze my access to our joint wealth. He forgot I spent a decade learning how to bypass corporate firewalls and trace ghost accounts through international banking networks. I typed my master password into the login terminal. The system granted me access. It was time to pull the thread Victoria so carelessly left dangling. The real war was no longer about keeping my house. It was about sending my husband to federal prison. The pale blue light of the encrypted laptop screen washed over the dark nursery, casting long, soft shadows against the flocked wallpaper. I sat in the stiff wooden rocking chair with a thick fleece blanket draped over my shoulders. The physical exhaustion that had weighed me down for days vanished entirely. The sharp, burning sensation of my surgical incision faded into a dull, distant hum. I was no longer a trapped postpartum housewife fighting for basic dignity in a freezing house. I was a senior forensic accountant sitting in my command center. I rested my fingers on the metallic keys. The rhythmic, reassuring tapping of the keyboard filled the silent room. It was a crisp, precise sound. Julian always hated that noise. He used to complain that my late-night audits disrupted his sleep. He never understood that the steady cadence of my typing was the only thing keeping his chaotic family ledgers balanced. Now that same sound served as the quiet soundtrack to his impending ruin. I started with the retail bank accounts. Julian believed he had executed a masterstroke by changing the passwords on our joint discretionary cards. It was a juvenile tactic. He merely altered the consumer-facing login credentials. He forgot that my firm handled the overarching tax structuring for Kensington Maritime during the previous fiscal year. I still possessed my secure administrative access tokens for the primary corporate portal. I bypassed his superficial blocks in less than 4 minutes. The main dashboard for the shipping empire loaded onto my screen. Rows and columns of raw financial data cascaded downward. To an untrained eye, the endless streams of numbers look like a dense, impenetrable wall of static. To a forensic auditor, numbers are simply a language. They tell a story free of emotion, free of bias, and free of lies. People can smile to your face while moving a mistress into your guest room, but the mathematics will always expose the truth. I pulled the operational ledgers for the current quarter, focusing specifically on the Anchorage port accounts Julian managed. I remembered Victoria complaining about the logistical gaps and the exorbitant maritime insurance premiums. I ran a filtering script isolating every outgoing wire transfer labeled under insurance or port hazard fees over the last 6 months. The results populated instantly. A clear, undeniable pattern emerged. Every 2 weeks, a staggering sum of capital left the primary Kensington holding account. Julian routed the funds through a secondary vendor clearinghouse, marking the transactions as hazard pay and container insurance adjustments. I cross-referenced the tax identification numbers of the receiving vendors. A legitimate maritime underwriter possesses a specific, verifiable corporate structure. The identification numbers Julian used did not match any established insurance firm in the global registry. They pointed to a newly formed limited liability company based in Seattle, Washington. I opened a separate browser window and accessed the Washington State Corporate Registry. I paid the nominal processing fee using my secure offshore routing number and downloaded the incorporation documents for the shell company. The file opened, revealing the names of the managing directors. The primary beneficiary listed on the charter was Maya. I leaned back in the rocking chair, staring at her name printed in stark black ink. The sheer audacity of the theft took my breath away. Julian was not just diverting a portion of his own salary to fund a secret second life. He was actively bleeding his own family business dry to afford a luxury real estate purchase for his pregnant assistant. I leaned forward and dug deeper into the metadata. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of the fraud. I pulled the raw cargo manifests for the Anchorage port, comparing them against the internal billing invoices. The architecture of his crime revealed itself layer by layer. It was a classic ghost shipping scheme. Julian was logging phantom cargo containers into the digital tracking system. He generated fake transit schedules for goods that did not exist. Because the fictitious containers were listed as transporting hazardous materials, he authorized premium insurance payouts from the company treasury to cover the fake liability. The masterpiece of his hubris was the origin of the stolen capital. Julian was not stealing from the general corporate fund. He was siphoning the money directly out of Victoria's operational budget. Victoria managed the global routing schedules from Seattle. She determined the fleet budgets and allocated the resources. Julian falsified the port manifests, knowing his sister rarely reviewed the raw localized data. Victoria read the polished quarterly summaries on airplanes, assuming the exorbitant hazard fees were simply the cost of doing business in the harsh Alaskan climate. Julian relied on her aristocratic complacency to mask his theft. He was defrauding the company investors. He was defrauding the federal government by claiming the stolen funds as tax-deductible operational losses. Most dangerously, he was defrauding his own ruthless sister. Victoria sat downstairs sipping expensive bourbon, entirely unaware that her beloved younger brother was using her hard-earned logistics budget to finance a secret nursery. The pieces of the psychological siege suddenly aligned, taking on a much darker context. Beatrice, arriving uninvited just 3 days after my cesarean section, was not merely an act of motherly overreach. Moving Maya into the guest suite was not just a display of blatant disrespect. The orchestrated gaslighting, the stolen pain medication, the fabricated psychiatric affidavit, all of it served a distinct tactical purpose. They needed me incapacitated. Julian knew the Seattle escrow was closing next Friday. He knew that under normal circumstances, I reviewed our personal and corporate tax liabilities at the end of every month. If I sat down at my desk with a clear head and a cup of coffee, I would spot the ghost ships and the shell company within an hour. I was the only person in the Kensington orbit possessing the specific forensic skill set to catch him. Beatrice orchestrated the distraction. They subjected me to a grueling campaign of domestic terror to keep me exhausted, disoriented, and fighting for my basic autonomy. They wanted me so consumed with defending my sanity and protecting my newborn son that I would never think to open the company ledgers. The medical conservatorship was their ultimate endgame. By locking me inside a psychiatric ward, Julian would secure legal control over my generational trust, thereby acquiring the perfect, pristine asset to borrow against when his corporate fraud eventually caught up with him. Their cruelty was not just personal. It was a calculated business strategy designed to dismantle my financial foundation and neutralize the only auditor who could send him to a federal penitentiary. I spent the next 3 hours compiling a devastating encrypted digital dossier. I downloaded every falsified manifest, every wire transfer receipt, and the incorporation documents linking Maya to the stolen funds. I organized the files with the clinical precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex amputation. I built an airtight, undeniable case of federal corporate fraud. The pale light of the Alaskan dawn began to filter through the frosted window panes of the nursery. The storm outside had broken, leaving behind a blinding expanse of fresh white snow. I closed the laptop and tucked it safely back into the hidden compartment beneath the baby blankets. Downstairs, the house began to stir. I heard the faint hum of the espresso machine in the kitchen. The soft thud of footsteps echoed along the hardwood corridor. My grief was gone. The lingering heartbreak over my ruined marriage evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. I knew exactly how to dismantle their empire, but I needed to wait for the perfect moment to strike. I needed to secure the physical perimeter of my estate before I detonated the digital bomb. A sharp, authoritative knock rapped against the nursery door. I did not answer. The brass handle turned and the door pushed open. Julian stepped into the cold room wearing a tailored wool suit. His hair was perfectly styled and his jaw was set in a tight, determined line. He did not look at Leo sleeping in the crib. He looked directly at me. In his left hand, he held a thick stack of dense legal paperwork printed on heavy bond stock. In his right hand, he carried the heavy, ostentatious gold Kensington family pen. He offered a charming, manipulative smile, the exact expression he reserved for closing terrible deals with unsuspecting clients. He stepped forward, holding the documents out toward me, initiating a sequence of events that would test my restraint like nothing else before. Julian stood in the doorway of the freezing nursery, holding the thick stack of dense legal paperwork. He wore a tailored wool suit that looked entirely out of place for an early weekend morning at home. His hair was impeccably styled, and his jaw set in a tight, determined line. He did not glance at our newborn son sleeping in the crib. He looked directly at me. "We need to discuss a minor administrative matter, Callista," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cold room. "Meet me in the study." He did not wait for a reply. He turned on his heel and walked away, expecting the blind obedience of a broken woman. I pulled the fleece blanket tighter around my shoulders. I took a slow, stabilizing breath, pushing the physical agony of my surgical incision to the darkest corner of my mind. I navigated the long hallway and descended the grand staircase. The study was the warmest room in the house, thanks to the roaring fire blazing in the stone hearth. Julian sat behind my late grandfather's massive mahogany desk. It was a profound violation of my space. The desk was a sacred piece of furniture where I learned the meticulous art of forensic accounting. Julian leaned back in the tufted leather chair, projecting the unearned confidence of a monarch. Beatrice hovered near the bookshelves, pretending to read the spines of vintage legal volumes, but her sharp eyes remained fixed on my face. I took a seat in the rigid guest chair opposite the desk. I kept my posture slouched and my gaze lowered, playing the role of the exhausted, overwhelmed housewife. Julian placed the stack of documents on the polished mahogany surface. He offered a charming, manipulative smile. It was the exact expression he utilized when closing terrible contracts with unsuspecting maritime clients. "The shipping business is experiencing a slight cash flow bottleneck," he began, his tone smooth and reassuring. "Victoria and I are restructuring the operational budget to accommodate the new hazard insurance premiums. We need a temporary injection of liquid capital to bridge the gap until the end of the fiscal quarter." I stared at the paperwork, feigning confusion. "You need money from me?" "Not exactly," Julian replied, leaning forward and folding his hands. "We simply need to leverage the equity of this estate. It is a standard bridge loan. The bank requires both of our signatures since we are married. It is merely a formality, Callista. The shipping firm will repay the loan within 90 days, and your precious ancestral home will remain entirely untouched." He slid a heavy, ostentatious gold pen across the mahogany table. It was the Kensington family pen, engraved with their aristocratic crest. The metal gleamed in the firelight. The object carried a palpable weight, representing generations of unearned wealth and predatory business tactics. "Just sign on the highlighted tabs," Julian instructed, tapping the thick bond paper. Handing a fraudulent contract to a senior forensic auditor is a spectacular miscalculation. I picked up the stack of papers. My grandfather, Elias Garcia, was a ruthless Anchorage estate litigator who built his fortune destroying men exactly like Julian. When I was 12 years old, I sat at this very mahogany desk while my grandfather taught me how to dissect legal jargon. He taught me to ignore the bold headings and the summary paragraphs. He trained my eyes to seek out the hidden choke points buried in the tiny indemnified clauses at the bottom of the page. I scanned the first page, playing the part of a confused layperson, while my mind processed the legalese at lightning speed. The document was formatted to look like a standard real estate equity transfer. It utilized banking terminology and listed the Anchorage property parcel numbers. But on the third page, nestled beneath a dense paragraph about liability limits, I found the trap door. Section 4, paragraph B, detailed the delegation of autonomous medical and financial authority due to incapacity. The air in my lungs turned to ice. It was not a bridge loan. It was a backdoor medical proxy disguised as a financial instrument. If I signed the highlighted tabs, I was granting Julian permanent, enduring conservatorship over my person and my estate. I would be legally declaring myself incompetent. The moment the ink dried on that page, Julian would possess the authority to authorize the fraudulent psychiatric hold drafted by Dr. Elias Thorne. He could lock me in a ward, drain the trust accounts, and move his pregnant mistress into the master suite without a single judge questioning his actions. I held the document in my trembling hands. A visceral, terrifying wave of panic threatened to break through my carefully constructed facade. If I refused to sign, Julian would realize I retained my cognitive faculties. He and Beatrice would drop the charade and immediately call their corrupt psychiatrist to orchestrate an involuntary commitment using the red herring evidence they gathered. I was trapped in a room with my abusers, staring down the barrel of a loaded legal gun. I needed a brilliant delay tactic. I needed to buy enough time to build an unbreakable snare. I let the documents slip from my fingers. The thick papers scattered across the mahogany desk. I slumped forward in the rigid chair, burying my face in my hands. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I squeezed my eyes shut tight until hot, stinging tears formed, pushing them out so they spilled down my cheeks. I let out a loud, racking sob. Julian recoiled in his leather chair. Beatrice stepped away from the bookshelves, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. "I cannot do this," I wailed, letting my voice crack and tremble. "I cannot read these words, Julian. My head is spinning. The letters are blurring together, and the baby kept me awake all night. My stomach is burning, and I just cannot focus on financial jargon right now." I looked up at him through a veil of fabricated tears. I let my hands shake visibly. "Please," I begged, injecting a pathetic, desperate tone into my voice. "Please, just give me 24 hours. Let me sleep for one night. Let me take my medication and rest my eyes. I will read it tomorrow morning. I promise I will sign whatever you need tomorrow when my brain fog clears." Julian stared at my tear-streaked face. He saw a broken, hysterical woman crumbling under the weight of postpartum depression. He did not see the cold, calculating auditor mapping out his federal indictment. He looked over at his mother. Beatrice gave a slow, subtle nod. They believed the illusion entirely. They thought they possessed absolute control over my psychological state. "Fine," Julian sighed, leaning back in the chair and crossing his arms. He sounded profoundly irritated, but a smug, confident gleam danced in his eyes. He believed he had won. "You have 24 hours, Callista. Go back to bed. Try to compose yourself. We will execute the paperwork tomorrow morning after breakfast." He left the documents scattered on the desk. More importantly, he left the heavy, gold Kensington family pen resting on the polished mahogany. I stood up, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped. I muttered a weak apology and shuffled out of the study. I walked down the long corridor toward the northern wing, playing the role of the defeated wife, until the nursery door clicked shut behind me. The moment the lock engaged, my tears stopped instantly. My hands ceased their trembling. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks and walked over to the frosted window, staring out at the frozen Alaskan landscape. Julian thought he secured his victory. He was entirely unaware he had just handed me the murder weapon. I possessed the physical proof of his fraudulent proxy attempt. I possessed the digital evidence of his federal corporate embezzlement. I possessed a 24-hour window where my enemies believed I was neutralized and sleeping. But I could not execute the final phase alone. I needed an external force capable of outmaneuvering the Kensington wealth and navigating the treacherous local judicial system. I needed someone who understood the lethal mechanics of the law just as well as my grandfather did. I walked to the hidden compartment in the closet and retrieved a prepaid burner phone I purchased weeks before my due date. I dialed a local Anchorage number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. I had the evidence, and I had the time. Now I needed to summon the most dangerous legal mind in the state to help me build an inescapable fortress around my abusers. I needed to leave the property without triggering their suspicion. My 24-hour window was ticking down. The winter sun barely crested the Chugach Mountains, casting a gray pallor over the frozen landscape. I moved mechanically through the nursery, packing a black canvas diaper bag. I folded tiny fleece garments and stacked sterile bottles. Beneath a package of infant wipes, I tucked the prepaid device and a printed dossier containing the corporate embezzlement evidence. I secured Leo into his insulated car seat, pulling the weather shield down to protect his fragile lungs from the sub-zero air. The grand staircase felt steeper than usual. My abdominal incision burned with a dull, fiery ache, but adrenaline pushed the pain aside. I reached the foyer just as Beatrice emerged from the formal dining room, holding her morning tea. Her sharp eyes darted from the car seat to my pale face. She stepped sideways, blocking my path to the front doors. She demanded to know where I was taking the newborn in such treacherous weather. I summoned my remaining theatrical reserves. I let my hands tremble against the plastic handle of the carrier. I forced a panicked waver into my voice. I told her Leo felt feverish during the night. I claimed his breathing sounded shallow, and the local pediatrician insisted on an immediate emergency consultation. I leaned into the hysterical mother persona, babbling about lung infections and neonatal intensive care units. Beatrice grimaced taking a swift step back to avoid my frantic energy. She waved her hand dismissively, telling me to go, and warning me not to damage Julian's luxury vehicle on the icy roads. My husband did not even emerge from the study to check on his son. The stout oak doors clicked shut behind me. The freezing Alaskan wind bit into my cheeks, but it felt like the first breath of pure oxygen I had tasted in days. I loaded the carrier into the heated cabin and drove down the long, winding driveway. The tires crunched over the packed snow. I watched the sprawling ancestral home fade in the rearview mirror. It no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a hunting ground. The medical clinic sat on the edge of downtown Anchorage, housed in a modern glass and steel building. I parked in the underground garage, bypassing the main reception area entirely. I utilized a secure service elevator keyed for staff members. The metal doors slid open, revealing a quiet, sterile corridor, smelling faintly of rubbing alcohol and industrial bleach. I walked past the empty examination rooms, pushing through a solid wooden door at the end of the hall. Aunt Simone sat at the circular conference table, her posture perfectly rigid. Simone Garcia was my late grandfather's eldest daughter and my fiercest protector. She spent 3 decades serving as a formidable state judge, building a reputation for dismantling corrupt politicians and arrogant corporate executives. She retired last year, but she still commanded the room like a magistrate holding court. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate knot. I set the infant carrier gently onto the carpeted floor. Simone stood up, pulling me into a fierce embrace. She did not offer hollow platitudes or ask how I felt. She possessed the same cold, analytical mind that ran in our bloodline. She stepped back, adjusting her silver-framed reading glasses, and extended her hand. I reached into the diaper bag and produced the hidden phone, along with the printed fraud dossier. I took a seat across from her, sipping a cup of black coffee she poured for me. I watched her read. Simone swiped through the photographs of the psychiatric affidavit drafted by the corrupt clinic physician. Her expression remained neutral, but her jaw tightened. Then she read the deceptive equity contract Julian attempted to force upon me earlier that morning. The sterile smell of the ambient air conditioning triggered a vivid memory. I was 12 years old, sitting in the expansive law office of my grandfather, Elias Garcia. The room smelled of polished leather and dark roasted coffee beans. My grandfather sat behind his massive desk, holding a dense corporate merger contract. He tossed the thick stack of paper toward me. The pages slapped against the wood. "Do not read the bold print." Callista, my grandfather, instructed, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Arrogant men use bold headers to distract you. They hide the knife in the footnotes. They bury the poison in the indemnified clauses at the bottom of the page. Every deceptive contract contains a choke point. Find the choke point, and you can suffocate their entire operation." Julian thought he was brilliant. He disguised a medical proxy as a bridge loan, assuming my postpartum exhaustion would blind me to the choke point. He handed Garcia a deceptive contract in our own ancestral home. It was a fatal, unforced error. Simone set the phone face down on the table. She removed her glasses, letting them hang from a delicate chain around her neck. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, burning with a terrifying judicial fury. "This affidavit is an absolute fabrication," Simone stated, her voice slicing through the quiet room. "That doctor has never evaluated you. Presenting this document to a magistrate constitutes premeditated extortion. The equity contract is a blatant attempt to subvert your physical autonomy. Julian is operating under the delusion that marital asset laws apply to this property." She opened her sleek leather briefcase and extracted a specialized encrypted tablet. She tapped the screen, accessing the private banking nodes reserved for high-net-worth clients. "Elias built your generation-skipping trust to be an ironclad fortress." Simone continued, her fingers flying across the digital keyboard. "The real estate is legally untouchable, but your liquid assets, the inheritance, sitting in the joint accounts Julian currently controls, are highly vulnerable. We are severing that access immediately." I watched as my aunt executed the financial counteroffensive. Utilizing her specialized legal authority and my biometric authorization, she transferred the entirety of my inherited liquid wealth out of the vulnerable domestic accounts. The capital vanished from the local grid, reappearing in a secure offshore blind trust located in the Cayman Islands. Julian believed he froze my discretionary spending. He was about to discover the well had run completely dry. Next, we secure the physical perimeter, Simone said, pulling a fresh legal pad from her briefcase. I am drafting an emergency trespass order. Given the documented evidence of medical extortion and the federal corporate embezzlement dossier you compiled, no judge in this district will deny the injunction. When the moment is right, we will legally banish them from the grounds. A profound sense of relief washed over me. The suffocating isolation shattered. I was no longer fighting a solo battle against a wealthy dynasty. I was backed by 2 generations of relentless legal mastery. We spent the next hour mapping out the exact chronological sequence of the trap. Every move was calculated to maximize their humiliation and neutralize their retaliatory capabilities. I gathered the infant carrier, preparing to return to the lion den. Simone placed a steady hand on my shoulder. She reminded me to maintain the illusion of the broken wife. She told me to let them feast on their arrogance for a few more days. I drove back to the estate as the afternoon shadows stretched long and dark across the snow. The luxury vehicle sat parked in the driveway, a symbol of their unearned confidence. I walked through the mahogany doors, carrying my sleeping son. The house still smelled of heavy rose perfume and imported espresso. Julian, Maya, and Beatrice sat in the living room, entirely oblivious to the lethal snare currently wrapping around their ankles. They thought they were isolating a helpless mother. They did not know the executioner was already inside the gates, waiting for the banquet to begin. I returned to the estate with a quiet mind and a frozen heart. The house buzzed with a frantic, chaotic energy. Beatrice stood in the center of the kitchen, wearing a tailored midnight blue evening gown. She held a polished silver clipboard, ticking off items with a manicured fingernail. She informed me without looking up that she canceled the private catering company. The Anchorage elite were arriving in less than 3 hours to celebrate the birth of the Kensington heir. She glanced at my pale, exhausted face and instructed me to prepare the hors d'oeuvres and the main courses. She claimed the distinguished guests preferred a traditional homemade touch. It was a thinly veiled tactical maneuver designed to force me into grueling physical labor. I did not argue. I tied a faded linen apron around my waist over my simple cotton dress. The heat radiating from the industrial double oven clashed with the bitter chill seeping up through the marble floors. I sliced crusty baguettes and arranged cured meats on heavy slate boards. I roasted root vegetables and basted a large cut of beef. My surgical incision burned with a constant fiery ache. My legs throbbed from standing on the unforgiving stone. I kept my head bowed and my expression vacant, playing the role of the broken, subservient maid they required me to be. The guests began arriving precisely at 7. The heavy brass doorbell rang continuously, cutting through the quiet winter night. Maya answered the mahogany front doors. She wore a stunning emerald silk dress that draped elegantly over her hidden pregnancy. She welcomed the local dignitaries, taking their heavy fur coats and directing them toward the warmth of the formal dining room. I stood in the shadow of the butler pantry, watching the surreal charade unfold. Maya played the glowing, gracious hostess perfectly. Julian stood by her side, laughing heartily and shaking hands with his colleagues. The guests accepted this bizarre domestic dynamic without a single question, because Beatrice had already poisoned the social well. My mother-in-law spent the previous week visiting her exclusive country club, spreading malicious whispers about my fragile mental state. The guests looked at me with deep, practiced pity. They viewed me as a tragic, broken figure, haunting the dark corners of my own home. I walked through the crowded room carrying a heavy silver tray of hot appetizers. The rich scent of expensive cologne, roasted garlic, and melting brie filled the air. A tall, silver-haired man took a stuffed mushroom from my platter. He did not look me in the eye. He simply muttered a curt dismissal as if I were a hired server hired for the evening. I recognized his profile immediately. It was Richard Sterling, the senior compliance officer for the Kensington Corporate Board of Directors. Beside him stood Thomas Croft, the primary institutional investor managing the Seattle fleet expansion budget. They were the men Julian reported to. They were the men Julian was currently defrauding to fund his secret second life. I poured expensive Pinot Noir into their crystal goblets, keeping my hands steady and my gaze lowered. I hovered near their elbows, listening intently as they discussed maritime logistics over their drinks. Dramatic irony coated every single interaction in the room. They assumed the silent, exhausted housewife serving their alcohol possessed zero comprehension of global corporate finance. They spoke freely about internal audits and routing delays. They openly discussed the exact Seattle Shell Company routing numbers Victoria had questioned earlier. Richard mentioned the exorbitant hazard pay adjustments Julian recently authorized for the northern ports. Thomas complained about the rising logistical costs of the new warehouse acquisitions on the coast. They handed me the missing puzzle pieces wrapped in casual dinner conversation. I mentally recorded every proper name, every corporate title, and every financial discrepancy they uttered. I was finalizing the missing links of my federal SEC report while dutifully refilling their sparkling water glasses. The dinner service stretched into a grueling physical endurance test. My lower back screamed in agony with every step. I carried heavy porcelain serving bowls from the hot kitchen to the long oak dining table. I cleared soiled plates, wiping breadcrumbs and spilled wine from the polished wood surface. Victoria sat near the center of the table, dominating the conversation with tales of her ruthless corporate conquests. Maya sat near the head of the table, right next to Julian. She regaled the attendees with fabricated stories about her recent logistics overhaul at the shipping firm. She effectively erased my entire decade of forensic contributions to the family ledger in a single evening. I returned to the kitchen to fetch the dessert course. I pulled a tray of glazed pastries from the warming rack. Through the swinging wooden door, I heard the sharp, clear chime of a silver fork tapping against a crystal champagne flute. The dining room fell completely silent. Julian stood up, holding his glass high. He smiled warmly at the gathered crowd, projecting the image of a humble, dedicated family man. He spoke about the challenges of the past year and the harsh economic realities of the maritime industry. He thanked his investors for their continued faith in the Kensington legacy. Then he raised his glass toward the opposite end of the long table. He offered a toast to the strong, capable women holding the family together through the bitter Alaskan winter. He looked directly at Beatrice, raising his glass in tribute to his mother. Then his gaze shifted, settling firmly on Maya. He gave his pregnant mistress a soft, lingering smile of profound gratitude. He did not glance toward the kitchen. He did not mention the mother of his newborn son. He publicly erased my existence in front of his entire professional network, cementing Maya as his true partner. A chorus of polite applause echoed through the dining room, followed by the gentle clinking of expensive glassware. I stood alone in the dim kitchen, gripping a tall stack of soiled antique silver plates. My hands trembled violently. The sheer weight of the profound disrespect threatened to shatter my carefully maintained composure. The physical pain, the lack of sleep, and the cruelty culminated in a rushing tidal wave of raw emotion. I lost my grip on the bottom dish. The heavy silver plates slipped from my fingers, crashing into the stainless steel sink basin. The harsh, jagged clatter rang out like a gunshot, cutting through the faint sound of the dinner party chatter. Soapy water splashed across my apron. The smell of leftover wine and rich gravy rose from the basin. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of the cold granite countertop until my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to breathe through my nose, counting backward from 10. I did not weep. I refused to shed a single tear over a man who stole my dignity to feed his own shallow ego. Every condescending remark they made in that dining room only sharpened the heavy blade I was preparing to swing. I waited for my racing heart to slow to a steady, manageable rhythm. The physical pain in my healing body was a temporary condition, but the legal snare I constructed with Simone was a permanent solution. I possessed the photographic evidence of the psychiatric extortion Beatrice plotted. I secured my inherited liquid assets in an unreachable offshore trust. Thanks to Richard and Thomas, I now held the specific names and board titles required to expedite the federal embezzlement audit against my husband. The digital dossier was finally complete. The trap was fully loaded. I just needed to hit the send button. But a critical logistical hurdle remained blocking my path to absolute victory. I could not trigger the financial freeze and lock the estate doors while 4 hostile, motivated adults occupied my property. If I initiated the strike while they slept, Julian would physically prevent me from changing the smart home security codes. Victoria would use her encrypted corporate devices to intercept the board emails before Richard or Thomas could read them. Beatrice would immediately summon her corrupt psychiatrist to execute the involuntary hold. I needed the battlefield entirely clear of enemy combatants. I needed them to willingly pack their bags and walk out the front door without suspecting a thing. I picked up a dry linen towel and began wiping the soapy water from the ruined silver plates. As I worked, a daring strategy began to form in my mind. Earlier in the evening, I listened to Beatrice and Victoria complain loudly about the freezing drafts sweeping through my old ancestral house. They hated the cold. They craved luxury and pampering. The solution was remarkably simple and deeply ironic. To execute my final quiet vengeance, I needed to purchase my abusers a spectacular, expensive vacation. The morning after the humiliating dinner party brought a dense, suffocating silence to the estate. The Anchorage sun struggled to penetrate the thick gray cloud cover, casting long, dreary shadows across the hardwood floors. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the evening. Half-empty crystal goblets stained with dried red wine clustered near the stainless steel sink. The lingering odor of roasted garlic mingled with the stale scent of expensive cigars Julian and his board members smoked on the back patio. My surgical incision throbbed, a steady, agonizing rhythm, reminding me of my physical limits. While the rest of the household slept off their alcohol-induced lethargy, I opened my encrypted laptop. I accessed the secure offshore blind trust Aunt Simone established the previous afternoon. I needed a location prestigious enough to tempt aristocratic tastes, but isolated enough to sever their connection to the outside world. I found the Aurora Pinnacle Resort. It was an ultra-exclusive hot springs retreat nestled deep in the Chugach Mountains. The drive required 4 hours of navigating treacherous, winding mountain roads. Most importantly, the resort enforced a strict digital detox policy. The property sat in a geographical dead zone, featuring 0 cellular reception and highly restricted satellite internet access. Once they checked in, they would be deaf and blind to the chaos erupting back in the city. I paid for the supreme luxury package using my secured funds. 3 days of volcanic mud baths, private thermal pools, and 5-star dining. It cost a small fortune, but purchasing the perfect execution chamber was worth every single penny. I printed the confirmation vouchers on thick ivory cardstock and slid them into elegant gold-embossed envelopes. At 10 o'clock, the invaders emerged from their respective quarters. They gathered in the formal dining room, looking rumpled and irritable. Beatrice rubbed her temples, complaining about a piercing migraine. Victoria scrolled through her encrypted mobile device, analyzing port logistics. Julian and Maya sat close together, sipping dark roast coffee, sharing low, private murmurs. I smoothed the front of my faded linen apron and walked into the room carrying a silver serving tray. Instead of breakfast pastries, the tray held the 4 gold envelopes. I forced a sickeningly sweet, naive tone into my voice. I practiced the specific pitch and cadence of a defeated woman seeking forgiveness. I want to apologize for my behavior over the past 2 weeks. I began keeping my gaze lowered to the polished oak floor. I know my postpartum recovery has been difficult. My hormones are unbalanced, and I have been a terrible burden to all of you. Beatrice scoffed softly, taking another sip of her chamomile tea. Julian leaned back, crossing his arms, waiting to see what concession I offered. You have all worked so hard taking care of the estate and managing the shipping firm during my breakdown. I continued, letting my voice waver slightly. I need total silence to recover my mental health and focus entirely on bonding with the baby. I booked a 3-day retreat for the 4 of you at the Aurora Pinnacle Resort. It is my way of saying thank you. Beatrice sat up straight, her migraine seemingly forgotten. Her manicured fingers darted out, snatching the ivory envelope from the silver tray. She broke the wax seal and scanned the itinerary. The Pinnacle was famously difficult to book, requiring a year-long waiting list. Beatrice possessed a deep weakness for exclusivity and status. "Well," she murmured, inspecting the foil lettering, "it is about time you demonstrated some proper gratitude, Callista. Your fragile constitution has certainly derailed the household rhythm. A thermal spa treatment is exactly what my arthritis requires." Victoria opened her envelope next. Her piercing eyes darted across the page, noting the 5-star amenities. "There is 0 cell service up there," she noted, a hint of hesitation coloring her tone. "I have international routing schedules to monitor." I countered the objection immediately, offering a soft, reassuring smile. "The corporate board praised your logistics overhaul last night, Victoria. You deserve a weekend away from the screens. The company will survive for 3 days without you." The flattery worked seamlessly. Her ego overrode her logistical caution. She nodded, slipping the voucher into her tailored blazer pocket. Julian looked at Maya. A silent, greedy communication passed between them. They envisioned a romantic, snowy getaway, far from the watchful eyes of Anchorage society. They saw an opulent vacation funded by the very wife they were plotting to institutionalize. Julian offered a tight, magnanimous nod. "This is a mature step forward, Callista," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We accept your apology. We will leave you to your rest." The atmosphere in the estate shifted from lethargic irritation to frantic excitement. The prospect of free indulgence spurred them into immediate action. They spent the next hour packing their designer luggage. I stood near the foyer, handing them warm coats and fetching missing leather gloves. I played the dutiful servant right up until the final second, ensuring nothing derailed their departure. By noon, 2 stout luxury sport utility vehicles sat idling in the snowy driveway. White exhaust plumed into the freezing winter air. Beatrice marched out first, wrapped in her thick mink coat, refusing to look back. Victoria followed, hauling a sleek metallic suitcase. Maya and Julian lingered near the doorway. Julian adjusted his cashmere scarf and offered a hollow parting instruction, telling me to lock the doors and get some sleep. He did not ask to hold his newborn son. He did not say goodbye to Leo. He simply turned his back and walked toward the warmth of the waiting vehicle, taking his pregnant mistress with him. I stepped onto the covered porch, the bitter wind biting at my exposed cheeks. I clutched Leo tightly against my chest, shielding his fragile face beneath a thick wool blanket. The stout tires crunched over the packed snow as the vehicles reversed out of the circular driveway. I watched the red taillights glow brightly against the whiteout conditions. They shifted into gear and accelerated down the winding road, heading toward the mountain pass. I waited until the faint hum of their engines faded, completely swallowed by the howling Alaskan wind. The moment the taillights vanished, my subservient mask fell away. The trembling in my hands ceased. The manufactured tears dried against my freezing skin. I stood in the quiet chill, feeling the immense, satisfying weight of profound solitude. The estate was empty. The battlefield was clear. The 4 hostile occupants driving away believed they had won the war. They did not realize they were driving straight into a communications blackout right as the legal guillotine dropped. I turned around and walked back inside my ancestral home, locking the mahogany doors behind me. The board was finally set for total annihilation, and the first order of business was turning this house into an impenetrable fortress. I sat in the quiet foyer listening to the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock. 20 minutes elapsed since the 2 luxury sport utility vehicles disappeared down the snowy driveway. The immense, sprawling estate felt entirely different now. The suffocating tension evaporated, leaving behind a vast, hollow silence. I allowed myself exactly 1 minute of rest before standing up. The time for silent observation was over. It was time to reconstruct the physical boundaries of my ancestral home. The low rumble of heavy diesel engines broke the quiet of the winter morning. I walked to the frosted front window and watched 3 stout commercial contractor vans pull into the circular driveway. The side panels bore the logo of the premier security and locksmith firm in Anchorage. I unlocked the front doors and stepped onto the porch, wrapping a thick wool shawl tightly around my shoulders. The lead foreman climbed out of the first van. He carried a dense metal toolbox and a thick clipboard. He took one look at my pale face and the grim determination in my eyes and skipped the standard pleasantries. I handed him a printed schematic of the estate, highlighting every single exterior access point. I requested the highest grade steel deadbolts available and instructed him to disable the primary garage bay doors. He nodded, signaling his crew. 7 technicians flooded the perimeter of the property, carrying industrial power tools and heavy boxes of steel hardware. The screech of high-speed drills echoed through the quiet rooms. It was a harsh, grating sound, but it felt like a symphony of liberation. I walked through the main hallway, breathing in the sharp, biting odor of fresh pine sawdust as the crew bored deeper holes into the door frames. The old brass cylinders tumbled to the floor, landing with dull, hollow clanks. In their place, the technicians installed dense, reinforced steel cores. The old keys Julian and Beatrice carried in their pockets were now useless pieces of jagged metal. With the exterior perimeter undergoing its transformation, I turned my attention to the interior infection. I climbed the sweeping staircase, pushing through the dull, fiery ache in my lower abdomen. Adrenaline served as a powerful analgesic, overriding the physical limitations of my recent surgery. I walked directly into the master suite. The room still reeked of the heavy, cloying rose perfume Beatrice favored. Her expensive cosmetics cluttered the marble vanity. Her silk sleepwear lay draped over the edge of the unmade king bed. She had claimed this space, attempting to push me into the shadows. I walked over to the vintage steamer trunks she forced the driver to haul upstairs just a few days ago. I unlatched the brass clasps and threw the lids open. I did not bother folding her garments. I grabbed handfuls of cashmere sweaters, tailored blouses, and expensive wool slacks, shoving them haphazardly into the open trunks. I swept my arm across the marble vanity, knocking the crystal perfume bottles and silver makeup compacts into a rigid cardboard box. I slammed the heavy trunk lids shut, securing the clasps. Grabbing the leather handles, I hauled the trunks out of my sanctuary. The physical exertion strained my healing muscles, but every inch I dragged those trunks felt like reclaiming a piece of my own soul. I pushed them into the corridor, leaving them stranded on the landing for the movers to take outside. Next, I descended the staircase and marched toward the southern wing. The downstairs guest suite belonged to Maya. Opening the solid oak door, I was met with the lingering scent of dark amber and vanilla. Her presence in this room represented the ultimate betrayal. She slept in my house, ate my food, and paraded her illicit pregnancy under my roof while wearing jewelry purchased with my marital assets. I opened the large walk-in closet. A row of pristine designer dresses and tailored winter coats hung in color-coordinated perfection. I walked into the mudroom and retrieved a roll of thick polyethylene industrial trash bags. Returning to the closet, I snapped the plastic open. I reached up and yanked the clothing down by the handful. The sharp snap of plastic hangers breaking echoed in the quiet suite. I stuffed the expensive garments into the dark bags, pressing the fabric down to make room for more. I cleared her entire wardrobe in less than 10 minutes. I moved to the ensuite bathroom, dumping her imported hair products and expensive skincare regimens directly into another black bag. I tied the thick plastic drawstrings tight. Dragging the heavy bags through the hallway, I hauled them out the front door and down the porch steps. I dropped them unceremoniously onto the icy asphalt of the driveway. Her glamorous facade now sat in a pile of garbage bags, freezing in the sub-zero Alaskan wind. Returning inside, I walked to the central smart home control panel mounted in the study. The glowing blue touchscreen controlled the internal climate, the alarm sensors, and the remote access cameras. Julian relied on his smartphone application to monitor the estate and adjust the ambient temperatures from his office at the shipping port. I accessed the master user directory using my original administrative credentials. I located his digital profile. With a single tap, I revoked his remote access rights. I deleted his biometric fingerprint data from the system registry. I erased the personalized key codes assigned to Victoria and Beatrice. I changed the master encryption password, locking the network down. The house went digitally dark to them. They could no longer view the cameras or unlock the secondary gates. The estate recognized only one master now. Just as I saved the new system parameters, a dark blue vehicle pulled into the driveway, parking behind the contractor vans. The emblem of the local county sheriff gleamed on the driver's side door. A secondary sedan parked right beside it. Aunt Simone stepped out of the sedan wearing her tailored charcoal coat and carrying her sleek leather briefcase. I met them on the front porch. The sheriff deputy was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose boots crunched heavily on the packed snow. He tipped his uniform hat, acknowledging me with a polite nod. The radio clipped to his shoulder cracked with sporadic dispatch chatter, serving as a stark reminder that the conflict had officially transitioned from a domestic dispute into a matter of law enforcement. Simone did not waste time with introductions. She opened her briefcase and handed the deputy a thick stack of verified legal documents. I stood beside her, wrapping my shawl tighter against the biting cold. "Deputy, this property is held in an irrevocable generation-skipping trust," Simone explained, her voice carrying the undeniable authority of a retired state judge. Callista Garcia is the sole legal trustee and beneficiary. Her husband possesses 0 ownership stake, 0 equity, and 0 legal right to occupy these premises without her explicit ongoing consent. The deputy reviewed the property deed, tracing the raised notary seals with a gloved finger. He nodded, his expression serious and professional. Furthermore, Simone continued extracting a second folder from her briefcase. "We are formally serving an emergency trespass order against Julian Kensington, Beatrice Kensington, Victoria Kensington, and Maya Sterling. These individuals engaged in a coordinated campaign of psychological harassment and documented medical extortion. We have photographic evidence of a fraudulent psychiatric affidavit they intended to use to unlawfully seize conservatorship over my client." She handed the deputy the printed photographs of the forged documents I discovered in the tote bag. The deputy studied the images of the fake diagnosis and the signature of the corrupt physician. His demeanor hardened. In the state of Alaska, property rights are ironclad, and the courts take a severely dim view of individuals attempting to manipulate the medical system for financial gain. "Understood, ma'am," the deputy said, sliding the documents into his official folio. "The trespass order is active the moment I log it into the county dispatch system. If any of these 4 individuals step foot on this parcel of land, they will be subject to immediate arrest and detainment. I will post the official physical notices on the primary entrance gates and the front door." He walked back to his cruiser to retrieve the bright orange legal notices. Simone turned to me, offering a rare, tight smile of profound approval. "The physical perimeter is secure," Simone murmured, watching the locksmiths pack their heavy tools into the vans. "The locks are changed. The trespass order is logged. They have no legal avenue to force their way back inside. This house is a fortress now, Callista." I looked up at the towering stone facade of my ancestral home. For 2 agonizing weeks, the walls felt like a suffocating cage. The warm, elegant rooms had been tainted by infidelity gaslighting and profound cruelty. But as I watched the deputy staple the bright orange trespass warning to the wooden post of the front porch, the oppressive atmosphere shattered. The physical transformation of the estate mirrored the internal shift within my own mind. I was no longer a terrified, isolated mother, bending to the whims of an arrogant shipping dynasty. I was the sovereign authority of my own territory. I had systematically stripped my enemies of their leverage, their access, and their shelter. They were currently sitting in a hot spring, unaware that their keys were useless and their belongings were sitting in trash bags in the snow. The contractors finished their work, handing me the solitary set of new steel keys. I thanked them and watched their van slowly exit the driveway. The deputy followed shortly after, taking up a stationary position in his cruiser at the end of the private access road. He was the final, undeniable barrier between my family and the abusers who tried to destroy us. I walked back into the silent foyer and engaged the heavy new deadbolt. The lock slid into place with a definitive metallic echo. The Citadel was legally and physically fortified. They had zero rights and absolutely no way back in. I walked toward the nursery where my encrypted laptop waited. The physical borders were secured, but the true devastation was about to occur in the digital realm. It was time to freeze the stolen capital and detonate the federal dossier that would unravel Julian's entire existence. The silence inside the estate felt vast and pristine. I walked back into the study where the morning fire had burned down to a pile of glowing red embers. The mahogany desk sat empty, save for the thick stack of fraudulent equity papers Julian abandoned hours earlier. Beside those deceptive documents lay the heavy gold Kensington family pen. The metallic casing gleamed in the dim ambient light, catching the faint reflection of the dying hearth. I pulled the leather chair out and sat down. From my canvas bag, I extracted a crisp, clean manila folder provided by Aunt Simone. Inside rested the emergency dissolution of marriage filings, along with the formal petition for full legal and physical custody of Leo. I picked up the gold pen. The instrument felt substantial resting between my fingers, carrying the historical weight of the shipping dynasty. Julian tried to use this exact tool to force me into a medical conservatorship. He intended to strip away my autonomy using his aristocratic leverage. In a profound act of poetic justice, I uncapped the gold cylinder and pressed the fine nib against the signature line of the divorce petition. The dark blue ink flowed smoothly across the heavy bond paper. I signed my name with deliberate, precise strokes, severing my legal ties to his toxic legacy, using his own weapon. I set the pen aside and opened my encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated, casting a pale glow across the dark, polished wood of the desk. The physical borders of my home were fortified by steel deadbolts and a stationed sheriff deputy. Now it was time to execute the digital slaughter. I logged into the overarching domestic banking portal, utilizing my primary administrative credentials. Julian thought he froze my access by changing a few consumer passwords, but he lacked the forensic expertise to understand root network permissions. I accessed the primary joint accounts. These were the channels feeding his daily lifestyle, holding the capital he used to entertain clients and purchase expensive gifts for his mistress. I navigated to the security settings and initiated a total unilateral freeze. I revoked all cardholder privileges attached to his name. I canceled the titanium corporate expense cards and the secondary credit lines. I watched the status icons shift from active green to a hard, undeniable red. The financial arteries supplying his unearned luxury were officially severed. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the telecommunications provider managing our cellular plans. The account was registered under my name, a relic of a time when I managed the practical logistics of our household. I selected the mobile numbers assigned to Julian, Beatrice, and Victoria. With 3 simple clicks, I terminated their service plans. Their encrypted smartphones were now reduced to useless pieces of glass and metal, incapable of sending a text or placing a call. The final task required the utmost precision. I opened my secure email client and attached the encrypted federal fraud dossier. The file contained the ghost shipping manifests, the offshore routing numbers, and the incorporation documents linking Maya to the stolen Seattle real estate capital. I populated the recipient field. I entered the direct email address for Richard Sterling, the senior compliance officer of the Kensington Board. I added Thomas Croft, the primary institutional investor. I included the intake address for the Regional Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. As a final calculated measure, I added the personal email of the lead defense attorney retained by Victoria. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the chilled air fill my lungs. I rested my finger over the trackpad. I did not feel a trace of hesitation. I pressed send. A crisp, satisfying whoosh sound echoed from the laptop speakers, cutting through the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the study. The progress bar flashed across the screen and vanished. The data was gone. It was hurtling through cyberspace, landing in the inboxes of the most powerful and ruthless men in the maritime industry. The trap had snapped shut. 4 hours north, the Aurora Pinnacle Resort sat nestled in a snowy, jagged valley of the Chugach Mountains. The air smelled of natural sulfur and burning cedar wood. The opulent retreat catered to clients who demanded supreme isolation and unparalleled indulgence. Julian and Maya lounged in a private thermal pool, their bodies submerged in the steaming, mineral-rich water. Thick white snow blanketed the cedar decking surrounding their secluded enclave. Julian wore a plush, monogrammed robe as he stepped out of the water. He walked toward the private cabana to order a bottle of vintage champagne to celebrate their romantic getaway. He found a uniformed concierge standing near the service kiosk, holding a silver tray. Julian ordered the most expensive bottle on the reserve list, handing the attendant his titanium credit card with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist. The concierge smiled politely and swiped the card through the wireless terminal. The machine emitted a low, sharp beep. The screen displayed a stark decline notice. The attendant offered an apologetic nod, assuming it was a simple fraud alert triggered by the remote location. He asked Julian for an alternative method of payment. Julian frowned, his ego bristling at the minor inconvenience. He retrieved a secondary card from his leather wallet and handed it over. The machine beeped again. A second decline. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up Julian's neck. He patted his pockets, realizing he had no physical cash. He told the concierge to charge the champagne directly to his suite, claiming a minor banking error caused the disruption. The concierge typed the suite number into the terminal. His polite smile faded into a mask of rigid professionalism. He informed Julian that the primary card holding the suite reservation had also been frozen. The resort required an active line of credit to authorize any further room charges. A heavy sinking sensation settled in Julian's stomach. He marched back to the thermal pool, grabbing his smartphone from the wooden side table. He tapped the screen, intending to call his private wealth manager to resolve the embarrassing hold. The phone displayed a glaring error message. No service. Emergency calls only. Panic, a foreign and unwelcome emotion, began to claw at the edges of his mind. He remembered the resort brochure mentioning a faint cellular signal available near the elevated observation deck on the 4th floor of the main lodge. He threw his plush robe over his shoulders, leaving Maya in the steaming water, and hurried through the snow-covered pathways. He climbed the wooden stairs to the observation deck, shivering in the freezing mountain air. He held his phone up toward the gray sky, pacing the perimeter of the wooden platform. Suddenly, the antenna icon flickered. A single weak bar of signal connected to the distant network. The device exploded into a frantic, chaotic symphony of noise. Dozens of missed call notifications flooded the screen in rapid succession. Text messages cascaded down the display, overlapping one another in a blur of urgent text. Voicemail alerts chimed relentlessly. Julian stared at the glowing screen, his breath pluming into thick white clouds in the freezing air. He opened the first text message. It was from Richard Sterling. The words were typed in all capital letters, demanding Julian return to Anchorage immediately for an emergency board tribunal. The next message was from Thomas Croft, informing Julian that his executive privileges were suspended, pending a formal external audit of the Northern Port manifests. Julian tapped the voicemail icon, holding the cold glass against his ear. Richard's voice echoed through the speaker, tight with fury and betrayal. The compliance officer detailed the contents of the email dossier. He listed the ghost shipping schedules, the falsified hazard pay, and the Seattle Shell Company registered under Maya's name. Richard stated that federal investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission were already securing the corporate servers at the Anchorage port. Julian's knees buckled. He grabbed the wooden railing to keep from collapsing onto the frozen deck. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. The unearned wealth, the aristocratic superiority, the carefully constructed illusion of success vanished in a matter of seconds. He was suspended. His assets were frozen. He was the prime target of a federal criminal investigation. Before he could process the sheer magnitude of his ruin, the heavy wooden doors of the observation deck burst open. Victoria marched onto the platform. She did not wear a plush spa robe. She wore her tailored winter coat. her face twisted into a mask of pure, lethal rage. She held her own encrypted tablet in her hands. Her personal attorney had managed to bypass the resort firewall using a satellite uplink to reach her. Victoria read the entire federal dossier. She saw the exact accounting routes Julian used to siphon capital from her Seattle logistics budget. She realized her own brother used her hard-earned operational funds to buy a house for his mistress. Julian looked at his sister, seeing the unmasked fury in her dark eyes. The united front of the Kensington dynasty shattered into a million jagged pieces on that freezing wooden deck. The alliance broke apart, replaced by the brutal reality of self-preservation. Julian tried to step forward, tried to offer a stammering excuse, but the words died in his throat. He realized with terrifying clarity that the quiet, exhausted housewife he left behind in Anchorage had not just locked him out of his house, she had systematically dismantled his entire life. The wait was the easiest part of the entire ordeal. I sat in the dim warmth of the study, watching the birch logs break apart into glowing orange embers. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a steady, metronomic rhythm. I held Leo against my chest, listening to his soft, even breathing. The estate wrapped around us like a protective fortress, shielding us from the bitter Alaskan winter. I knew it was only a matter of time before the financial cascade pulled them back down the mountain. 4 hours after the digital dossier hit the corporate servers, the sound of frantic engines pierced the quiet night. Headlights swept across the frosted windows, casting chaotic shadows against the living room walls. I heard the harsh screech of anti-lock brakes engaging as 2 heavy vehicles skidded onto the icy circular driveway. Car doors slammed shut in rapid succession, echoing through the freezing air. I did not rush to the foyer. I adjusted the thick woolen blanket wrapped around my son, ensuring his tiny head was shielded from any drafts. I walked slowly down the corridor, savoring the profound shift in power. Through the reinforced glass panes of the front doors, I watched the final act of their arrogance unravel. Julian stormed onto the covered porch. His plush spa resort wardrobe was woefully inadequate for the negative 10-degree wind chill. He wore a thin cashmere sweater and a light jacket, his face flushed red from panic and the biting cold. He thrust his brass key into the lock cylinder. The jagged metal slid uselessly into the new steel core, refusing to catch the tumblers. He jiggled the handle, his movements growing frantic and erratic. He turned to the digital keypad mounted on the doorframe. His numb fingers punched in his personalized access code. The panel emitted a harsh electronic buzz and flashed a bright warning red. He tried a second time, resulting in the same stark denial. Behind him, the rest of the family gathered on the frozen wooden deck, their confused, frantic breath plumed into thick white clouds hanging in the frigid air. Beatrice hugged her mink coat tight against her shivering frame, her face twisted in a mask of indignant fury. Maya stood near the porch railing, hugging her arms across her chest, her teeth chattering audibly. Victoria stood apart from the group. She held her encrypted tablet in her gloved hands, glaring at Julian with a predatory intensity. Julian pounded his bare fist against the heavy glass. He demanded I open the door. He shouted that there was a banking error and a misunderstanding with the corporate board. He ordered me to turn off the security system so he could enter his own home and fix the problem. I stepped forward into the glow of the porch light. Julian stopped shouting, his eyes widening as he registered the calm, unyielding expression on my face. I did not yell back. I did not offer a single word of explanation or anger. I looked down at the brass mail slot built into the heavy oak door. I held the thick manila envelope Aunt Simone prepared for me. I slid the heavy package through the narrow metal flap. It landed on the frozen welcome mat outside with a dull, hollow thud. Julian stared at it for a brief second before dropping to his knees to snatch it up. His trembling fingers tore the paper flap open. The contents spilled out into his hands, illuminated by the overhead porch bulb. The first document was the emergency eviction and trespass notice signed by a county judge. The second was the formal petition for the dissolution of our marriage, bearing my signature in his own gold ink. The third was a printed copy of the Federal Corporate Fraud Report, currently sitting in the inbox of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Julian read the top pages, his breath catching in his throat. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow ghost. He dropped the divorce papers onto the snowy deck, staring at the highlighted financial ledgers documenting his fake maritime insurance premiums. Victoria did not wait for an explanation. She stepped forward and ripped the federal report from his hands. She scanned the pages, her sharp eyes darting across the numerical evidence I compiled. The crisp light revealed the exact routing numbers linking her Seattle logistics budget to the shell company Julian established for Maya. The Kensington Alliance imploded on my front porch. Victoria turned on her brother, her voice cutting through the howling wind like a serrated knife. She did not yell, but the venom in her tone was unmistakable. She called him a pathetic thief. She laid out the reality of his situation, explaining that he used her operational funds to finance a real estate purchase for an assistant. She told him he destroyed a century-old shipping legacy to feed his own fragile ego. She promised she would testify against him in federal court to protect her own shares in the company. Maya backed away from Julian, her eyes wide with terror. The romantic illusion of an opulent life funded by a wealthy executive shattered into a million frozen pieces. She realized the man she chose to tether herself to was not a maritime titan. He was a bankrupt felon facing imminent federal indictment. The custom gold pendant resting against her collarbone was bought with stolen money. She looked at Julian with deep, unfiltered disgust, realizing her own name was listed on the fraudulent incorporation documents. She was now a co-conspirator in a federal crime. Beatrice picked up the eviction notice from the snow. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The matriarch, who prided herself on controlling the social narrative of Anchorage society, stared at the legal banishment. The realization that her reign was permanently extinguished washed over her features. The elite circles she spent decades cultivating do not associate with evicted mothers of convicted embezzlers. The country club invitations, the charity galas, the deferential treatment, it was all gone. She looked up at me through the glass, her aristocratic pride crumbling into pathetic despair. Julian pressed his hands against the glass, pleading with me. He begged me to let them inside to discuss the situation like a family. He promised he could fix the ledgers if I just gave him access to the corporate network. I remained silent. I looked past his desperate face toward the end of the long driveway. The flashing red and blue lights of a county cruiser broke through the darkness, cutting through the falling snow. The sheriff deputy parked his vehicle, blocking their luxury sport utility vehicles from retreating. He stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his heavy-duty winter jacket. His boots crunched loudly on the packed ice as he approached the porch. The deputy did not engage in negotiations. He pointed a gloved finger toward the bright orange trespass warning stapled to the wooden pillar. He instructed the 4 shivering individuals to step away from the residence immediately. Julian tried to leverage his family name, citing his position at the shipping firm. The deputy remained unfazed. He informed Julian that executive titles hold no weight when federal agents from the Port Authority are currently waiting at the downtown precinct. The deputy advised Julian that a warrant for his arrest regarding corporate embezzlement was active, and he was to be transported for questioning. The cold efficiency of law enforcement resolved the climax without a single raised voice. The deputy corralled the ruined, shivering group down the porch steps. Victoria walked to her vehicle without looking back, prioritizing her own legal defense. Maya followed her, head bowed in humiliation. Beatrice stumbled through the snow, leaning on the deputy for support, her glamorous facade erased by the bitter cold and the staggering weight of her new reality. The deputy placed Julian into the back of the cruiser, closing the heavy metal door on his former life. The flashing emergency lights painted the snowy trees in rhythmic pulses of red and blue. The vehicles shifted into gear. I stood in the foyer watching them leave. The heavy crunch of the cruiser tires echoed through the quiet night, growing fainter as they drove down the winding road. Eventually, the sound faded, swallowed by the vast, peaceful silence of the Alaskan wilderness. I turned away from the glass doors. I walked back down the long corridor toward the study. The fire in the hearth still crackled, shedding a warm golden light across the mahogany furniture. I sat down in the tufted leather chair, holding Leo close to my heart. He slept soundly, blissfully unaware of the storm that just passed. I looked down at his peaceful face, feeling a profound sense of quiet victory. I had surgically excised the parasites from our lives, protecting my ancestral home and my son's future. I closed my eyes, leaning back in the chair, and let the beautiful, unyielding silence wash over me. The fire in the mahogany study had burned down to a soft, pulsing bed of orange embers, casting long, gentle shadows across the quiet room. I sat in the tufted leather chair, the heavy silence of the Alaskan winter wrapping around the estate like a protective shroud. Against my chest, Leo breathed in the slow, rhythmic cadence of deep infant slumber. His tiny hands were curled into soft fists, resting innocently against my collarbone. In the stillness of that frozen night, long after the flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser had faded into the blinding snow, the true weight of what had just transpired finally settled over me. This was never merely a story about a scorned wife seeking retribution against a deceitful husband, nor was it simply a tactical dismantling of a corrupt corporate empire. Stripped of the legal maneuvers and the frozen bank accounts, the entire ordeal was, at its very core, a desperate battle for the soul of my child. When we talk about legacy in American culture, we often default to the tangible. We measure a family's worth by the sprawling estates they pass down, the trust funds they secure, or the corporate shipping empires bearing their aristocratic names. We are taught to revere the self-made titans and the generational wealth that supposedly defines success and stability within a traditional family structure. But looking down at Leo's peaceful face, I realized how profoundly hollow that definition of legacy truly is. Julian inherited an empire, but he was bankrupt of character. Beatrice spent her entire life curating a flawless social image, yet she fundamentally failed at the most critical responsibility of motherhood. She never taught her son the value of accountability. Beatrice raised a boy who believed the world was a chessboard, and the people in his life were merely pawns to be sacrificed for his comfort. She shielded him from the consequences of his own arrogance, teaching him that entitlement could mask incompetence and that a thick wallet could overwrite basic human decency. In doing so, she did not raise a man equipped to lead and protect a family. She raised a predator. The terrifying ease with which Julian attempted to strip away my autonomy, the casual cruelty of moving his pregnant mistress into my home while I bled from childbirth, these were not sudden moral failings. They were the inevitable harvest of a childhood completely devoid of emotional awareness and fairness. As a mother holding my newborn son, the profound responsibility of shaping a human life came into agonizingly sharp focus. The traditional family structure is not supposed to be a theatrical stage for projecting perfection to the outside world. It is meant to be the crucible where honesty is forged. If we want to raise resilient, honorable children, we must begin by teaching them that truth is the only foundation that will not crumble when the winter storms arrive. I made a silent vow to Leo right then and there. He would not grow up in a house where secrets festered in the guest rooms or where love was conditional on maintaining a profitable, smiling facade. I will teach my son the quiet, unyielding power of fairness. He will learn that true strength does not require shouting, bullying, or gaslighting the vulnerable to maintain control. Instead, strength is found in the courage to look at your own mistakes without flinching and to take ownership of your failures. He will understand that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who can offer him absolutely nothing in return. In a society that often rewards the loudest, most ruthless voices, I will guide Leo to value emotional awareness above all else. He will learn to identify his own feelings and deeply respect the boundaries of others, ensuring he never grows up to view empathy as a weakness to be exploited for personal gain. Parenting is perhaps the most terrifying act of faith we undertake as human beings. We are handed these blank slates, and the lessons we imprint upon them ripple out across generations, shaping the world long after we are gone. Julian's betrayal was a generational curse, a toxic inheritance passed seamlessly from a cold, calculating mother to an arrogant, deceitful son. But curses only hold power until someone possesses the courage to stand in the doorway and say, "No further." By locking Julian out of this estate, I did not just protect my physical safety or my financial independence. I protected Leo from the slow, insidious poison of a father who would have taught him that deceit is cleverness and cruelty is just business. The journey of raising a child with absolute integrity is not a path of constant ease. It requires the exhausting daily work of modeling the behavior we wish to see in our children. It means having the difficult conversations, setting the hard boundaries, and sometimes making the agonizing choice to dismantle your own life so your child does not have to grow up in the ruins of a lie. The American ideal of a strong family is not about two parents sharing a roof at any cost, maintaining a polite fiction for the sake of the neighbors. It is about shared values, mutual respect, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, even when the truth is deeply uncomfortable. If you have ever looked at your own children and felt that fierce, overwhelming need to break a cycle of trauma to shield them from the shadows of your own past, I hope this story resonates with you. The work we do within the quiet walls of our homes is the most important work of our lives. It takes a village to recognize the wolves wearing sheep's clothing, and it takes a community to find the strength to lock the doors against them. I invite you to join our community, to share your own stories of resilience, and to find solace in the shared experiences of those who refuse to let the darkness win. Please subscribe and follow the channel Linda Vengeance, where we continue to explore the intricate, often painful, but ultimately triumphant realities of family betrayal and the unyielding strength of those who fight for the truth. As the embers in the fireplace finally faded into gray ash, leaving the study cloaked in the soft, pale light of the impending dawn, I pulled the blanket a little tighter around my sleeping son. The house was finally ours, quiet and secure. Yet as I watched the snow continue to fall outside the frosted window, covering the tracks of those who had tried to break us, a lingering question remained suspended in the freezing air. We can change the locks, we can rewrite the ledgers, and we can swear to be infinitely better than the generations that came before us. But when the night is long and the shadows stretch across the floorboards of the homes we have fought so fiercely to protect, we must always wonder, are we truly shaping the future, or are we simply waiting to see what our children will do when they are finally handed the keys?